The four of us hunkered behind the fallen tree, looking through the binoculars in turns as we surveyed the cabin. The cabin had been abandoned for as long as we could remember, and now, suddenly, there was a candle burning in the window. This had been a summer to remember for sure, and it would become a summer that none of us would forget. Richie, James, Trey, and I had been friends since kindergarten, and we had spent every summer playing around the neighborhood and having fun. This summer, however, was special. We were 11 this year, or close enough to make no difference, and some of the restrictions had been taken off of us. We could ride our bikes a little farther, stay out a little closer to dark, and explore the woods around our house, as long as we went in a group. The woods had long been a source of restricted adventure for us, but now we were free to explore them as we chose. The first day of summer, we all met at my house with backpacks and camping gear so we could start exploring. Terry had paper and attempted to make a map of the woods. Richie had brought some of his dad's tools so we could make some forts or little bases out in the woods. James had the nose of his air rifle poking up from his bag, and I had my wrist rocket hanging from the back of my shorts. We felt like explorers preparing to head out into unknown territory. We just knew that this would be a summer to remember. We began by exploring the places that we knew in the woods, places our dads had taken us camping to, and our parents had let us go on our own. Terry made a crude map for us to follow, and as the summer unfolded, the map got bigger and bigger. Soon the small camp and the creek were joined by the berry bushes, the big rock, the snake sighting place, where we had seen a big black snake there, but it slithered away, and the cabin. The cabin was the oddest thing that we had found in the woods. It seemed to be abandoned, but it was so well maintained that it had to be owned by someone. The land was well kept as well, there was no trail either, and the trees would have made a small car difficult to get in there. We figured it was some forest dweller's summer cabin or something and left it alone. We had other things to occupy our time, though. The cabin was soon forgotten about. We spent the first month of summer building forts and making a raft so we could sail down the creek. We thought that we might play pirates if we had a raft. We started lashing some of the big logs together with some rope from my dad's shed. We made a sail from some old sheets. The raft was laughably small. Only one of us could fit comfortably on it at a time. But we still had fun imagining the four of us sailing up the creek to the small lake that it led to. On July 1st, the first weekend of high summer, we asked our parents if we could camp out in the woods for the weekend. We had all been in Boy Scouts for a few years, and we'd all gone camping before. We felt that we could survive in the woods with some food to cook and some shelter to keep the elements off. To our surprise, our parents agreed, on the grounds that we do not camp too far in the woods, and that we mark on a map where we would be so they could find us. No more than a mile into the woods, my dad had said, and make sure you clean up after yourself so you don't attract anything that you can't handle. So we packed our knapsacks and prepared for a weekend in the great outdoors. We hadn't realized how close we were to the cabin when we set up camp, but then Terry had to come back with firewood and told us about the candle burning. We had discovered that we were only about 20 minutes from it. We'd all been sent out on some errand, and Terry was the last one to return. I'd been setting up the tents, Richie had made the journey to the creek for water, James had been digging the latrine that we would use, and Terry had been getting firewood. It was getting on in the afternoon when he finally arrived, and the hot dogs in the cooler were calling our name. He dropped the firewood and told us that we'd have to come see this. And so here we are, watching the cabin for signs of life. Other than the candle, however, there wasn't much to see. There was no vehicle in front of the cabin, no lights on in the house, and had it not been for the candle, it would have been just as cold and abandoned as always. As it grew darker and no lights came on inside either, we lost interest in the cabin and returned to our campsite. It had been a momentary curiosity at best, but our stomachs were grumbling. We were ready for dinner. As the darkness settled around us, we had our weenies on sticks and roasting nicely over the fire. We had begun chatting about the adventures that we would have this weekend, and the laughter around our fire was loud and merry. James had put root beers in our cooler, and we were breaking out the Jiffy Pop as we prepared to tell ghost stories. Ghost stories were a huge part of any campout, and we meant to outdo each other with tales of terror that would rival anything we had ever read. "I got one," Terry said, letting his hot dog slowly turn into a charcoal lump. I read it on No Sleep. This guy lives with his grandpa, and he said his friend turned into a tree. Terry laid out the story, built up as he told about the kids exploring the woods and finding a special grove. We listened, leaning in a little as he wove the tale. The story wasn't really scary as much as it was sad, but the atmosphere of the dark woods made it all seem pretty spooky nonetheless. I was reaching to get a second hot dog, the first one having been eaten in 3 bites, when I thought I heard something out in the woods. It sounded big, bigger than us at least. And I took out the little flashlight that I had and shone it into the forest. James looked up from spearing another hot dog, craning his neck to look out into the spot my flashlight was illuminating. Something out there? He asked. No clue. But I thought I heard something. All of them turned to look then, eyes peering into the murky darkness, but whatever it had been, it was either still or had moved on. I got one, Richie said. It's pretty scary, though. Hope you can handle it. They all laughed, throwing a few marshmallows at him before he leaned in and started his story. There were 4 friends on a camping trip. They were staying the night in the woods, just their sleeping bags and the fire to keep them safe against the elements. Well, they had felt all night like something was watching them, so they decided to set a watch to make sure that nothing snuck up on them. They would each keep watch for 2 hours while the others slept. And as the others settled in, the first boy sat and watched the night. The fire crackled as we listened. I thought I heard the snap of the twig again. Was something out there? Was it stalking us? It sounded big, but I suppose it could be just a deer or a possum or something. This story isn't about him, though. This story isn't about the second boy, either. This story is about the third boy. The boy who must watch through the depths of the night. The second boy had no sooner shaken him awake than he was curled in his sleeping bag and snoring happily. The third boy had slept for a few hours. He was so tired. He didn't like staying up late, and he's used to being snug in his bed when the sun went down. He sat by the fire, the warmth wafting into his face. He felt warm and comfy, and began to drowse. I heard the stick crack to my left and cut my eyes in that direction. Just then, something stepped on a branch out in the woods, and the boy found his drowsiness melted away. What was that? Some sort of animal? A person? A monster coming to eat him? The boy sat up a little straighter. He was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open, and the fire felt so good. I could see something from the corner of my eye, but I couldn't be sure what it was. An animal? A person? A monster coming to eat us up? He looked around, but he could see nothing. The small fire did little to light the forest around him, so he reached for more wood and began to build it up again. His hands shook with each piece that he grabbed, and the coals danced as he slid the fresh logs into the flames. He soon had the fire raging, a burning pyre that threatened to catch the lowest branch on fire. But still, he could see only the vaguest outline of what stalked him. Whatever it was, it looked big. Like a bear, but bigger. It had a towering presence that made it appear monstrous in the dancing light of our campfire. It appeared to be wearing clothes, but I couldn't be sure. Was that a dress? Maybe a robe. It was coming closer as we all sat rapidly and listened to Richie's story. He watched the shape as it stalked closer, unable to tell what it might be. It was so big, it could be anything. A bear, a person. Anything could be in these dark woods. He took one of the burning sticks in the fire and held it out before him like a torch, trying to ward off whatever this diabolical creature might be. It came on, heedless of the burning stick, and the boy began to scream as it stepped into the firelight, and he caught sight of his stalker. The creature was not so bold. It hung back slightly, not daring to get close enough to be seen. When they found the boys, all of them had been killed. Of the 3 that had been in the sleeping bags, nothing was ever found. Just a lot of blood soaking into the bags themselves. Of the Watcher, however, they found him still at his post. He leaned in, the fire making his face look sinister. He was frozen in fear, his heart having stopped from terror. I turned then, looking over Terry's shoulder and into the woods. Whatever it had been was gone. Wow, James said, putting a fresh marshmallow on to replace the one that had fallen into the fire as he sat listening. That was a great story. Yeah, I agreed, scouting around behind them for the shape. I bet I know who scared him so bad, James said, a little smile on his lips. I bet it was Soap Sally. Chill ran up my spine. Don't even say her name out loud, I quavered, the others looking just as shocked. Soap Sally was not something to be joked about in the woods at night. Soap Sally was a local legend, a washerwoman who had done her washing at the watering hole for as long as anyone could remember. She made her own soap, made candles too, and was said to be able to make spells and potions as well. When she was found to be making her soap out of the bones of runaway children, she was burned as a witch with only the briefest of trials. She was still used as a way to scare bad kids into doing what they were supposed to be doing. There were still disappearances from time to time. I heard a rumor. Those kids who went missing in the next town were taken by Soap Sally, James continued, clearly intending to milk this story for all it was worth. James, I started, but I tensed when I heard the stick snap too close to our campsite. I hear she found them out past curfew and just snatched them up. They ran, of course, but she just got them one by one, took them back to her lair to make them into soap. From behind James, a shape rose, a looming shadow that seemed to grow from the ground. I gasped, looking at Terry and Richie as it rose over 6 feet tall. Their mouths were hanging open, their eyes as big as dinner plates, and James clearly thought we were scared by his story. Then she hacked them up and boiled all the fat off them. She made them into soap, and when their parents found the soap the next day, they used it to wash their hands. They never knew that they were washing themselves with the bodies of their dead kids. And somewhere, that old crone laughed at them. As they mourned their loss, she laughed and laughed, stalking the night as she looked for more children to... But he had clearly noticed us all crab walking away from him, rolling his eyes and laughing. Come on, guys, it's just a story. Quit goofing and... He gasped as the long black nails clenched his shoulders. When the monstrous woman bent down, her mouth with sharp teeth grinning much too wide, he began to scream like a stuck hog. We all screamed then, running into the woods like bullets fired from a gun. James screamed behind us, begging us to help him. We were only 11. What could we do against something like that? We all stayed together as we realized that my house was the closest. We all ran for it. The moon was high and bright, and if it hadn't been nearly full, we likely would have never found our way. The woods that we had so often played in seemed sinister. A children's fairy tale forest, and we wanted to reach the safety of home before the witch could swoop down on us and gobble us up. Every limb that grabbed our shirt was a witch's claw. Every hole that tried to stop us was a hand coming up to grab us, and every sound was that horrid creature in hot pursuit. We breathed a little easier when we broke the tree line and made it to the row of fences that marked our neighborhood. My dad was having a beer on the back porch when we got there, and it seemed that Richie's dad had decided to join him since they had both been childless that night. It was only about 9:30 and the both of them looked up expectantly as we came running up. Boys got spooked by a deer already? My dad joked, seeming to realize that we were one short. Where's James? I sobbed as I tried to catch my breath, and Dad must have caught enough to understand that someone had taken James. He got us all inside, called the police. Richie's dad called James's parents as he did. Before long, everyone's parents were there, and the men had begun searching the woods. Dad wanted to take us with him, but we all refused to go. We had a scare, and when the police arrived, the whole group took to the woods to find James. They came back a few hours later to tell us there had been no sign of him at our campsite. Is there anywhere that you can think of that he might be, boys? Maybe somewhere in the woods where this person might have taken him? He said person because he refused to believe any kind of Soap Sally talk. He wanted to keep this in the real world, and that meant that if a woman had taken an 11-year-old boy against his will, they were likely close. The cabin! Richie almost hissed. looking at us for support. Remember, we saw a candle burning there earlier. Maybe it's her cabin. We showed them on the map where the cabin was, and they told us to stay here as they all went to investigate. They were gone about an hour when I heard the back door open, and the 4 dejected fathers of my group came shuffling in. They told the 3 of us to head off to bed so they could talk, but we hunkered down at the top of the stairs and listened as they told what they'd seen. James's mother cried a lot, his father holding her tight. Police were still there. The sheriff had come in with more deputies from a neighboring town, and they were searching the cabin from top to bottom. They had found the door unlocked, and when they had gone inside, they had found that the cabin wasn't just someone's summer home. There was blood. So much blood. And the police had found the remains of children in that place. Bones, clothes, skin, hair, and bowls of fat that had yet to be rendered into tallow. The kitchen had several items for making soap, and they said the stove was still hot when they arrived. They found a shirt on top of the pile, and James's father had identified it as the one James had been wearing when he left home that night. They searched those woods for 3 days, but they never found James. Not until he appeared on his parents' doorstep one morning. I was eating dinner that night, still reeling from what I had been through in the woods, as my mom talked about how wonderful it had been that the community had come together to support James's family. I went to take her a casserole this morning, and she was going through the gifts that she had been left by the town. There were casseroles, and gift cards, and grocery bags, even a nice bag of soap from someone. My mouth went dry when I heard that. I asked her what she meant. Well, someone had delivered a bag of soaps to them this morning. They looked really great. Handmade, so smooth. She told me that I could have some if I wanted. I left it in the upstairs bathroom for you guys to use. My mom stopped talking when I started hyperventilating. I don't think the police took us seriously at first, but once they did, whatever they did with the soap and the found bone fragments in it, they started taking us a lot more seriously. James's mother was hospitalized after that, going into a full-blown catatonic state. The search was redoubled as they tried to find the killer. That was a long and strange summer full of curfews and lots of dads riding around on neighborhood watch detail as they took the kids from summer school to home or to and from summer events. They never found the woman who took James. My friends and I never expected that they would. I never went into those woods again. It's been years since that campout, but sometimes I still look at the woods from the back porch. I swear I can see the specter of Soap Sally as she looms at the edge of the woods. I graduate high school this year, and I think I might just get as far away from this town and my childhood as possible. I can't imagine raising kids in a place where they could wind up as bricks of soap on your porch. Cryptic sat in the empty hot tub underneath the massive oak tree in the yard. Surrounded by snow from the recent freak winter storm, he peered through the old aviator goggles at the sunrise. His outfit of half-laced military boots, a winter coat, and matching Speedo did well at keeping him warm. It was nearly May, and the uncanny fall of snow the previous day let Cryptic know everything he needed to know about the coming days. Gary chattered from the front porch as Cryptic refilled his red gas can with aged bourbon. He glanced back for a second at the little ferret on the porch before resting the now-filled can on the hot tub's edge and inserting the long end of a 3-foot crazy straw into it. He took a long pull from the straw as he gazed into his neighbor's backyard. There was nearly a quarter mile between the two houses, but Cryptic sat in the empty hot tub at the edge of the property line, watching the old woman's place. The thoughts running through his mind were preparing him for the same argument he has had with Lady Snickerbottom every spring. She was in no way a lady, and it disgusted Cryptic that her parents had had the audacity to name her as such. Her husband, Rufus, had passed away a few years ago, and since that day, Lady had sadly gotten worse and worse in attitude. Rufus had seemed to be her voice of reason, yet without him, it left her unbridled, and her descent into Karenness began to increase exponentially. Cryptic was waiting for her to exit the house. He was waiting to see her repeat the same action that he had seen her do every day for the past week. Gary chattered and flopped around on the porch as if he was ready for the argument also. Cryptic looked back to watch him curl into a tight ball, chatter, then pop onto his feet and prance around with explosive energy. I know, just calm down, you little weasel, I got this. Gary chattered angrily, turned back towards the front door, and ran headfirst into the wall instead. Then he stood back up, shook himself like a dog, and sped off into the house. That thing has about 2 brain cells left, and he's always trying to lend 3 out, Cryptic said under his breath, as he turned back to Rufus and Lady's yard. He sat there for another 30 minutes, as the 3-foot straw began sucking air from the bottom of the gas can full of bourbon. Then, just before Cryptic stood to refill the gas can, he saw it. Corn, nuts, and seed flew out of his neighbor's backyard. This act immediately caused a handful of squirrels to flood the woman's yard. She had been feeding them for the past week, and Cryptic knew nothing good would come of it. He had to find a way to stop her before the glorified tree rats overran the place. Cryptic stood to talk to the difficult woman. He stepped from the hot tub, tripped, fell on his face, then quickly rose to his feet and wobbled a bit. Apparently a gallon of bourbon at 8 in the morning seemed to hinder his sense of balance. Carrying a flask in one hand and a Nerf gun in the other, he charged Lady's house, hoping to confront her about the squirrels before she retreated inside and ignored him. A few little chatters from the ground level let Cryptic know that Gary had left the porch and was running alongside him. This pleased him because, other than the ferret's sworn duty to repel beavers from the property, Gary was rather skilled at keeping the tree rat menace at bay. As the two of them approached the back door of the neighbor's house, the 10 or 12 squirrels formed a semicircle around the supply of food on the ground. The shifty little bastards began to flick their tails and bark at them before Cryptic called out, "Lady! I know you saw me coming. We need to have a talk about you feeding and attracting these arboreal demons to the area." Her response came from within the house, out of an open window. "These are my friends, Cryptic. Now you need to get off my property before I call the police. Now get! You drunken mallard enthusiast." Gary scampered over to Cryptic as he began to grumble and grind his teeth with anger at the old woman. As the ferret reached his leg, he bit Cryptic, causing him to look down. "Ow! What the fuck is this? What?" Gary stared up at Cryptic and chattered before running off towards the squirrel's tribe leader. He only knew that it was the leader by the acorn headdress resting gently on the creature's head. As Gary and the squirrel squeaked and barked back and forth to each other for a few minutes, he returned with a worried look and then took off towards the house. Cryptic, realizing that negotiations had gone shaky at best, turned to follow the little ferret. He turned, stumbled, and nearly crashed to the ground, but caught himself and continued after Gary. They sat at the kitchen table. A bowl of tiger shrimp sat between them. A look of skepticism covered Cryptic's face as he looked at Gary. On the other hand, Gary felt no awkward tension and casually snatched one of those massive shrimp from the bowl. Instead of eating it, he added it to his pile of hidden food that sat in plain view at the corner of the table. Cryptic was the first to speak, but before saying a word, he pulled a jug of moonshine from the cabinet, poured a packet of Kool-Aid into it, and shook the jug vigorously. He finally spoke as he retrieved his crazy straw glasses from the drawer, knowing the glasses make you look more sophisticated. "When were you going to tell me you spoke Squirreltonese?" Gary looked shocked at the accusation. "How long have you been in bed with those tree vermin?" "Answer me!" Cryptic shouted as he threw a shrimp, bouncing it off the table near Gary and causing it to splat against the back wall. Gary sheepishly pulled 2 shrimp from his pile in the corner and laid them out on the table. "2? 2 what? 2 weeks? 2 days? Who are you working for?" Cryptic shouted again, before taking a strikingly long pull of the grape Kool-Aid moonshine. The ferret laid down next to the shrimp and cuddled up next to it, pretending to fall asleep. Then suddenly he sprang up and bit down on the shrimp, thrashing it back and forth. Ah, little double agent action, I see. Gary stopped and smiled, then proceeded to bounce around the table with an abundance of excitement before getting too close to the edge and falling off. He hit the ground with a loud thud and a confused look, then scurried off into the living room and behind the couch. Cryptic shook his head at the clumsy animal before taking another long pull from the straw. He then snatched up the partially eaten shrimp from the table, dunked it in the mixture of ketchup and mayonnaise, then pulled the meat from the tail with his teeth. For the next 3 days, Cryptic woke up early in the morning to stare out at the barren fields that seemed to mirror his aversion for effort. He never watched the field itself, but more so the neighbor's yard, where he watched the crazed woman throw out food, and the number of squirrels slowly grew. Something is going on over there, Gary. I don't know where it's going, but I feel it's nowhere good. Gary suddenly began chattering wildly and hopping around, running into walls. Cryptic looked confused and concerned at the little crackhead weasel. The hell's your problem, you little idiot? Just as Gary ran headfirst into a chair leg, Cryptic turned around and noticed out the window precisely what the little creature was excited about. Vincent, his beloved mallard, and the rest of the ducks that returned to his sanctuary year after year. A tear of joy ran solemnly down his face at the sight of the birds returning for the spring. He jumped for joy, but his socks slipped on the tile, causing him to come crashing to the ground. He bounced his head off the counter on his way down. He awoke from his involuntary nap in the middle of the night. As he looked around the room, touching the trickle of blood on his forehead, he noticed a plethora of beady little eyes staring at him, menacingly, from the windows. The squirrels had mounted a reconnaissance mission. He searched the darkness for any trace of his guard weasel. After hearing some odd noises, he realized that Gary was aggressively trying to make love to the dish sponge in the sink. He realized that he needed to take matters into his own hands. He shouted and flailed his arms in an attempt to scare the squirrel squad away. When that failed to work, he pulled the sponge away from Gary and threw it at the window. Only a soft pat sounded as the sponge hit the window, but it was enough to scatter the tree rats. The clock on the microwave read 3:30 in the morning, and now that the vermin had scattered, Cryptic thought it would be a decent time to start cooking breakfast. It was much earlier than he usually rose for the day, and with the light of the moon still out, he chose to leave the lights off and cook in the darkness. After placing a skillet on the stove, Gary scampered up to him and bit his finger before he could open the fridge door. "Hey, what the fuck? I'll punch you across the room, you little asshole." After the words left his mouth, he realized that blood still trickled slowly down his face. "Okay, clean up first. I get you. Still don't need to be a dick and bite me over it." Gary chattered and bounced his front paws in a stomping motion. "No, it's not the only way to get my attention. You could learn to pour me a drink for one, instead of being a lazy fur noodle." Gary chattered again, then took off after where the sponge had landed, most likely to resume violating Cryptic's last remaining dish-cleaning utensil. "You know that sponge will never love you back," Cryptic called out just as Vincent, followed by 2 other ducks, waddled into the house. "Don't worry, I'll get my own drink then." He pulled out and took off the lid of a fishbowl of Everclear from the cupboard. He poured the contents into a camelback, slung it over his shoulders, and kept the mouthpiece securely between his lips. A few large gulps later, he tended to the blood on his face. As he cleaned the wound on his forehead, he noticed something out of the window that instantly infuriated him. In the light of the moon, he could see Snicklebottom shamble onto his property, tossing out something along the ground. Unfortunately, the darkness was too great and his vision too blurry from the grain alcohol to discern precisely what it was. However, he had a solid suspicion she was throwing seeds and nuts into his yard, drawing the squirrels to cross enemy lines. "Vincent! Perimeter check, we have invaders!" With a soft quack, he and his 2 cohorts turned and waddled quickly out of the house. Within 30 seconds, he could see as the birds took flight. They flew towards the sketchy old woman before turning and instead landing gracefully into the pond. Cryptic took another long swig from the Everclear mouthpiece before muttering to himself, "Well, shit. Breakfast would have to wait." Having been distracted, blood still ran down his cheek as he grasped the ankle of his defensive mannequin leg. He ran full tilt toward Lady, chasing her off of his property and only stumbling twice on the way. As he heard her door shut behind her after she ran inside, Cryptic took another long swig, then howled at the moon in triumph. His celebration lasted only a few seconds before realizing that he was standing outside his property and had become surrounded by a tribe of squirrels with a taste for blood and vengeance. The violent history between Cryptic and the squirrels was hazy, even to him. Both sides blamed the other for what happened that day so many years ago. Generations of squirrels passed down the tale, pitting Cryptic as the villain. Cryptic blamed a member of the tribe for his indecisiveness when crossing the road at 11 at night that day. Although the squirrel tribe had lost a leader to Cryptic's Geo Metro tires, a fragile truce was still made. The validity and enforcement of that truce had been called into question as of late. The squirrels would remain out of Cryptic's property, and he would, in turn, avoid conflict with the growing army. Cryptic's heart sank with fear. He realized that off his own property and carrying a weapon aggressively towards the army had unwittingly broken the non-verbal Squirrel Treaty of 2014. Dozens and dozens of furry tails flicked in the moonlight, and a single bark from their leader caused the rest of the group to fall into a frenzy. He backed quickly towards the property line, swinging the leg at any rodent beginning to advance towards him. He took another long pull from the camelback, long enough to begin sucking air. The swinging of the mannequin leg began to fail at deterring the squirrels, and the first of them leapt to attack. Landing on his chest, the furry little rodent soldier took a bite before bounding away again. Cryptic swung the leg, hoping for an easy hit. However, the only contact was the leg hitting himself hard in the chest, nearly knocking the wind out of him. He began to panic, and just as he turned to sprint back to the house, he hit the edge of the hot tub in the middle of his thigh, causing him to topple over into the basin. He screamed in fear, expecting the rodents to descend upon him, biting and clawing, until there was little more than a skeleton left of him. And suddenly, flutters of wings sounded above him, and the ducks quickly drove the squirrels back into the crazed arms of Lady, who was waiting just outside her back door. Cryptic peeked over the edge of the hot tub and drunkenly called out, "This isn't over, Lady! My attack ducks will..." Vincent pecked Cryptic in the face as if to tell him to keep his mouth shut and not antagonize. "Oh, fuck," he said, before pushing Vincent aside and continuing, "This is just beginning! You have been warned!" Without waiting for a response, he rose out of the back of the hot tub and stumbled back towards his house. Walking through the door, he told Vincent thank you before the bird flew off to wherever it had planned to sleep for the rest of the morning. Laying passed out next to the sink sponge was Gary on the floor of the kitchen. Cryptic rolled his eyes at the sight, but it caused the room to start spinning. He lifted his hand to hold his head in an attempt to slow the dizziness. Instead, he pulled his head down and remembered he still had yet to finish bandaging his head. After loosely wrapping gauze around his head, he opened the fridge to resume cooking breakfast. Becoming distracted again, he removed the camelback and refilled it with Everclear from the fishbowl. Proud of himself for filling the pack without spilling any, he put it back over his shoulders, took a big swig, and sat down in front of the open fridge door to decide what to cook. He settled for a dozen standard chicken eggs, no longer having the luxury of ostrich eggs since Sarah had betrayed him and impaled herself on the pitchfork. Reaching out to pull them off the shelf, Cryptic fell forward and passed out with his head in the open fridge. When he finally awoke, Gary was pushing the sponge towards him and chattering softly. He picked his head up and wiped the drool from his lips before taking another pull on the mouthpiece. Gary nudged the sponge towards Cryptic again and looked up at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Cryptic said, as his eyes began to focus. "No, Gary, I don't want to fuck your sponge. You know that's the only sponge we had, right?" Gary cocked his head to the side before picking up the sponge and running off into the back room with it. Shaking his head at the little weasel, he grabbed the leftover meatloaf from the open fridge to eat his breakfast. As he sat at the table, the entire collection of 8 ducks waddled into the house and rested in a circle around the coffee table in the living room. Cryptic watched as the ducks began tearing up small pieces of paper and arranging them in small groups or seemingly very specific locations on the table. It took him far longer than he wished to admit to realize, but the ducks were having a war room briefing. He quickly finished the rest of the meatloaf and staggered over to the living room to get a better look at the table. The ducks clearly knew something big was coming. More than Cryptic knew for sure. Standing in the living room, Cryptic was able to see out of the kitchen window. What he saw caused his heart to race and fear to ball up in his chest. Lady's property held hundreds, if not thousands, of squirrels, each one standing at attention near the property line, looking towards Cryptic's house. Are they attacking? Vincent, is it go time? Without waiting for any form of answer, he scrambled back to his bedroom, crashing and shuffling, and banging could be heard from within the room. Only a few moments later, Cryptic emerged once again, a broken set of football shoulder pads missing one shoulder, a Richard Nixon Halloween mask, a jock strap including a cup, one hockey leg guard, and a pair of combat boots with the laces missing was all he wore. As he walked back into the living room, he carried his mannequin leg as if it was a mighty sword. He sat on the couch and retrieved the box of flypaper that he kept on the end table next to the empty box of tissue paper. As he wrapped the strips of sticky paper around the thigh of the plastic leg, a thought popped in his mind. "Hey, hold this for a minute," Cryptic said as he tossed the leg to Gary, knocking him to the ground and subsequently sticking him to the floor. He ran through the house and nearly tripped down the stairs as he released a sinister cackle from his chest. Throwing open the door at the bottom of the steps, he looked out over his mold and fungus farm. Various patches of different molds and mushrooms covered nearly 2/3 of the basement. He perused his selection until stopping and grinning wildly at the destroying angels flourishing in the corner. Thinking that they would most definitely do the trick, he plucked handfuls of the spongy mushrooms, intending to mix the deadly substance in with a mixture of food. With his handful of poisonous shrooms, he began to retreat back up the stairs. Not before picking 3 large morel mushrooms to cook for later, and a modest handful of stargazers. When he returned to the kitchen, he set the morels on the stove and poured himself a tall glass of his favorite moonshine from under the counter. He dropped the stargazers and a few slices of lemon into the glass and got to work mixing up a paste of seeds, berries, nuts, and the destroying angels. He would sneak out under the light of the moon and distribute squirrel feeders filled with the mixture around Lady's yard. Just as Cryptic sat at the kitchen table to concoct his poison mixture, he heard a strange whimpering sound. Looking around the floor where it had seemingly come from, he realized that Gary was still stuck to the floor under the flypaper-covered mannequin leg. Reluctantly, Cryptic stood back up and pulled the leg from the floor, and then pulled Gary from the flypaper. After tossing the ferret onto the couch, he returned to the kitchen table. As Cryptic mixed up the poison, Gary climbed his pants, then shirt, and finally managed to reach the top of the table. Gary snagged some of the seeds and berries from the pile before Cryptic could mix them into the batch. Cryptic began to reprimand the little weasel, but was cut off by Gary chattering back angrily as he backed away from the piles. He hopped and argued as he reversed away from Cryptic, protesting that he can get to keep the small morsels of food before backing up too far and falling off the table. He hit the ground and released the seeds and berries that he had stole, causing them to fly into the air before rolling away on the hardwood. Without retrieving his treasures, he quickly returned to his feet and scampered off back towards the ducks, who were still quacking softly to each other as they formulated their battle plans. Cryptic simply rolled his eyes at the stupidity of Gary's actions and took a significant gulp of his drink, swallowing 2 of the stargazers whole. He quickly finished the rest of his poison traps and placed them by the door in preparation for deployment after the sun went down. While Cryptic finished his alcohol-infused mushroom drink, he sliced and cooked the morels on the stove. Fried mushrooms are always a favorite of his. Gary, on the other hand, wanted no part of this meal and continued to bite at the one hockey leg guard that Cryptic was wearing. After kicking him away for the 10th time, Cryptic finally yelled out at him, "God damn it, what? What do you want? What do you want to eat then? I know you don't want fried mushrooms, so what?" Gary looked up at Cryptic for a second, then ran off to the other side of the kitchen, retrieving the dish sponge and resuming an aggressive attempt at fornicating with it. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Vincent and 2 other ducks fly past the window, causing him to realize that they had ended their briefing and left the house. He wondered what conclusions and plans they had come to about the army of squirrels sitting angrily at the edge of the property. Cryptic knew that he would soon find out anyway. The chattering and barking from the squirrels grew deafening, and he knew there was no way to delay the inevitable much longer. As the sun faded over the horizon and the land became only illuminated by the moonlight, the squirrels had quieted. Now was the moment. Pulling a tie-dyed sheet over himself in an attempt to appear invisible to the abhorrent rodents, he snatched up all the poison-filled feeders and opened the warped and waving door to the outside. The moonshine and mushroom mixture he had downed earlier was clearly starting to have an effect. Cryptic immediately tripped and fell to the ground as he walked through the doorway to the sound of hissing. Looking back to see what had caused him to fall, a smile formed on his face. Countless troops of possums had arrived. He realized that Vincent had left earlier to call in a favor from the Alliance. Cryptic shushed as the possums returned to his feet and bounded off into the darkness towards Lady's house. Vincent, Gary, and the newly recruited army of possums sat on the porch staring at the darkness of the night sky. It took nearly 5 minutes before Gary chattered and squeaked, then grabbed one of the poison feeders left on the ground and began to drag it across the yard. Various possums followed suit and grabbed the remainder of the feeders and followed Gary towards the neighbor's yard. Vincent simply shook his head at the thought of Cryptic cackling as he ran off into the night, having completely forgotten to retrieve the feeders from the ground after his fall. The next morning, Cryptic leapt from his car bed with the excitement of seeing how much damage his late-night plan had caused. The sudden movement startled Gary, causing him to fall off the toilet seat that he had been sleeping on and thud against the inside of the dry bowl. When Cryptic reached the window that looked out towards Lady's house, he expected to see masses of poison and dead squirrels. What he saw, however, was angry but seemingly well-fed masses of leaf-wearing branch hoppers lined up along the property line. Little did Cryptic know that the same mushrooms that would have ended his life in mere hours had little to no effect on the tree rats. He also noticed the horde of possums in his yard, gnawing sticks into fine points and crafting weapons. "Well, Gary, my plan failed. Looks like we have to do this the old-fashioned way," he said, as he grabbed the sticky flypaper-wrapped mannequin leg. As he moved towards the door, taking a deep breath and beginning to prepare himself to step out into the fray, he glanced back at Gary. Gary stood there adorned with a miniature football helmet and carrying his dish sponge. Cryptic placed the drink helmet on his head that he had just filled with moonshine. He took a long pull at the straw to prime the burning liquid into his system. Just before Cryptic could speak to the little ferret, a voice could be heard from outside. "The time has come, Cryptic. Your bones will feed my army. I'm taking your land. We both know this has been a long time coming." Cryptic's eyes widened at the sound of Lady's screeching maniacal voice. He kicked the door open and stepped through, swinging the manacled leg onto his shoulder. Vincent quacked out what seemed to be orders at the possums under his command. Fear rose in Cryptic's throat at the sight of just how many squirrels had accumulated under the command of his neighbor. No less than 1,000, he guessed. As they all chattered and barked, he took another long pull from the straw, draining more moonshine from the reservoirs in the side of the helmet, and washing as much of the fear back down his throat as he could. He held out his leg, looking like Babe Ruth calling his home run. As he began to yell out the best battle cry that he could think of, he was cut off by Lady before a sound could escape his lips with her own. "Once more onto the branch!" she yelled, as she held up the random stick that she was using as a makeshift wizard staff. Somewhat disgruntled at being interrupted before he could get his own war cry out, Cryptic took another pull from the straw dangling near his lips. Gary tossed the sponge aside and scampered past him. By the time he hit the bottom of the steps, Vincent quacked loudly, and the 2 yards erupted in a graphic display of possum and squirrel violence. Blood sprayed, fur flew, and after a quick moment of shock at the sudden escalation, Cryptic held the leg over his head and charged. The squirrels flooded like a tidal wave into Cryptic's yard. Their numbers felt vastly overwhelming, but he knew that there was only one thing that he could do. He staggered to wind up his swing just as the wave of squirrels came within distance. He swung the leg, connecting with 3 of the squirrels that jumped to attack. The impact cracked and thudded against each of their 3 bodies. As he held the leg in front of his face, he realized that all 3 bodies had stuck to the flypaper. Knowing he didn't have enough time to remove them, he swung again, connecting squirrels with squirrels. Before letting the panic get to him, he swung again, only this time missing completely and falling to the ground. Just before the squirrels had a chance to swarm his body, small paper bags hit the ground nearby, showering the battlefield in mixed nuts, an unavoidable distraction. The squirrels scattered to obtain as many as they could. Cryptic looked up as he returned shakily to his feet. Vincent, Larry, and Xavier flew past and made a return to the house to grab more bags of nuts to drop. He rose his hand into the air as a thank you to the ducks for the help. The viciousness of the possums as they ripped and tore the squirrels apart startled Cryptic and made him glad his ducks had formed the alliance so many years ago. His shocked gaze out over the carnage was pulled back into focus by his chattering and barking club. Diving back into the fray, he swung wildly, connecting some squirrels to the flypaper and turning others into flying squirrels. Some of the tree rats clung to his clothes and climbed his body as he ran for the lady. Biting and clawing the entire way up his body, blood began to soak his clothes. A final pull on his straw depleted the rest of the moonshine in his hat. His body ached, his vision blurred, his balance waned, but he continued on. In his final few steps, he brought the squirrel-covered plastic leg over his head and swung down hard. Lady easily sidestepped him, since he had been imagining himself doing it in slow motion, and struck Cryptic in the head with a gnarled branch in her hand. He fell to his knees and saw the drink hat crash against the earth. The leg had also been knocked from his hands and wiggled along the ground as the attached squirrels attempted to get away. Without hesitation, Cryptic looked up at Lady and uppercut her between the legs. The old woman howled out in pain and dropped to the ground. As he rose to his feet, he grasped tightly to the ankle of the mannequin leg, once more raising the squirrel-encrusted club over his head. "You know, I hate squirrels, lady. Accept your defeat and call your retreat. No one has touched me like that since my husband passed," Lady said between cringes of pain. "Fine, have it your... Wait, what?" "Do it again. Harder," she said, as she began rising to her feet and rubbing all over her body in a very erotic manner. "Are you coming on to me?" "Oh, hell no." Cryptic swung down hard and the squirrel's covered plastic thigh squeaked off of the old woman's head. She fell back, now rendered unconscious. With the fall of Lady, the squirrels almost immediately scattered, leaving behind only a few nuts, the bodies of the dead, triumphant possums, and a very confused Cryptic. The moonshine began to take a heavy effect on him as he grabbed Lady by the ankle and dragged her unconscious body towards the old woman's back door. By the time he got her close enough to open the door, he realized it was locked. By that time, her robes had bunched up around her armpits and covered her face. Cryptic gently set her foot on the edge of her back porch, told himself it was close enough, and then began his drunken stumble back to his house. He dropped his chattering club and it skittered off into the woods and up a tree. With no more squirrels in sight, he walked through the kitchen door and collapsed onto the chair. After taking a deep breath, the flap on the small doggy door swung open, and Gary, covered in drops of blood, trotted into the kitchen. "You see, Gary? This is what happens when you feed squirrels." Little Weasel ignored his words and instead picked up the dish sponge and carried it back into the bedroom. As Cryptic watched him walk away, he realized the great squirrel migration was over. For now. I'm not sure which is weirder. The fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was so unimpressed with it. Dad had come from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive, just like always. Now, this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, that Mom should stay home, keep the kids, and that everything should be like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. And I remember for a while that Mom would meet him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home, but eventually Dad told her to stop, so the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's just how he liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner, and I hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up to ask Mom if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from his day at work, and he had started asking us about our day when he saw how horrified we all looked. "What?" he asked. "What's the matter?" All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be oblivious to something like that. See, in the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. See, wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into pavement. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. "Honey," Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, "did something happen at work today?" "No," Dad said, looking at her speculatively. "Well, Stubings had changed the no-slip grating on the walkways, but it's not really weird." "Are you sure? Nothing odd happened today?" she asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. "I guess, maybe," he seemed to think about it. "There was that guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down. He helped me up, but that was nothing." When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. "Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here." "Dad, there's a huge hole in your head. I was never what you'd call subtle." Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. "What the hell are you talking about?" "There's a big hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that? Are you trying to be funny? Because you know I don't like jokes." Despite his gruff tone, he began feeling around his forehead as if trying to find the source of our discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing us a favor by looking in the first place, but when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it was a hurt shudder. Not really. It's more like the shudder you get when you find an itch and scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment, before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing in the hallway. We found him at the kitchen table eating his dinner like any other night. "Sit down," he told us once he noticed that we were there. "Your mother's meatloaf's getting cold." "Dad," I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital?" Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deeply phlegmy way. "Doctor would just poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not gonna go to no doctor. Sit down and eat." He went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and began eating again. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never laughed. Well, that's not true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle, 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often, smiled daily. "It's just hard to tell with your father. He's not quite as obvious about it as we are." After that, I started paying more attention to Dad. And I'd come to a point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumbles when he chuckled, the minute crinkles at the edge of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when Dad was in a good mood, when he felt less like hitting and more like patting. And you could maybe ask him for a favor, and when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned. And it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff across the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Ray Ramon bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract as though it was breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized that he had caught me staring. Either go to bed or stop staring at me. You're creeping me out. I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as the hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went out somewhere. I wish that he'd wear it inside too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. I mean, it wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone is staring at you. Like it was getting bigger too, but if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it. His only exception to ignorance being the hat that he wore outside. My dad was stubborn. But he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off of himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, I could have maybe put a finger inside of it. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still, he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said that it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it's meant to go away, then it'll do it on its own. He went back to work, he came home, he watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I found myself looking at my father more and more often, the gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even through his hat when he wore it. I started dreaming about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around and looked at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, the eye stared at me until I came awake gasping. And then, one day, he came to breakfast and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. I mean, it wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, crater. Just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. My mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respirations as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending that nothing was wrong. But it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name and left for work with only half of his breakfast eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it. It would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down for breakfast after I knew he had gone to work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I couldn't understand. The words were alien, harsh, and unwantable, but I felt I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I might have moved out. And then about a month and a half after that spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said that he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way that her eyes looked told me that something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and I wouldn't find out till later that it was because Dad locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there as he bumped around. Mom would leave his food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notepad upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding. My brother and I had been very curious about what had been happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and I scampered slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my dad's back, clad in a robe and knee socks, as he bent over the day's breakfast tray that Mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that sat beside the bowl of oatmeal. And then he stood, and I had to put a hand over my mouth as his head came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes that they use to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep. And as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and he took the tray back into the bedroom. But when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much in those last few days. In my dreams, the hole always had an eye. But in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat to my left, my mom sat to my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing my father's clothes. And the food he ate was pushed into the circling hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine, like a corpse's. Its teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind. And when his face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose into an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened, and a low whispering began to assault my ears. Every night the whisper became a little louder, and over time I came to understand the words. Shally, shally, may, ray, fori, ma, gra, li, roly, gray, ga, su, roly, dre, ma. The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dreams meant, but I knew they weren't meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me all this time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words it spoke to myself during my day. I'd catch myself making little rhymes out of them. They were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do. And one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a while. There was a noise coming from inside. It sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in and gotten hurt. But I think even then I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest, and he was lying on the floor and flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk. Probably couldn't even see. But he seemed to understand that I was here to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shally, shally, may, ray. Fori, may, gra. Lee, roly, grey, ga. Su, roly, drema. As the words left me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried that it would be a huge eye like the one that I had seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy as his leathery skin slid out of that dark pool. Below the black pit that was my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened and embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was. And when his withered feet touched down onto the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing and tittered as he pulled it around himself. Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be too upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you. He then left, just walked out of our house and into the night. And as the sun comes up over Mom's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of my experience as possible so I won't forget any of it. But it's so weird that it's hard to put all of it into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. Since I was a little kid, my great-uncle Ivan has lived with us in our basement. He's a surrealist painter by trade, and his works are beautifully done, whimsical and thought-provoking oil masterpieces, worthy of being stared at for hours. Each time I look at one of his paintings, I find something new that I've never noticed before. Uncle Ivan is the most talented artist I have ever met. And yet, his work's not even known to the most obscure collectors. I wonder sometimes if he'll be like Van Gogh. Nobody will know properly of his genius until after he's gone. When he had a stroke and he lost the ability to speak, he began painting obsessively, showing the world the beauty in his mind which only otherwise would be lost without words. My parents built him a studio in the backyard for his 70th birthday. They had friends in construction, and we had a very large property in the country, so they built him a very big studio with high ceilings, knowing he would find a way to utilize every inch available. And utilize it he did. The walls were painted white with primer, and then he set himself to work. Inside this massive space, he created another world. Within a year, his designs were outlined in black and white, with splashes of color beginning to be applied in places. Already, the overall effect was astonishing. It was like entering the surreal space of his own mind, an Alice in Wonderland world that sparked the imagination and resembled the uncanny landscape of dreams long forgotten. It was when the colors were completely filled in that the illusion became complete. And one day I went outside to his workspace in the backyard to find that he had vanished. He was gone, and I could make no sense of it. "Uncle Ivan!" I called out in the empty, echoing studio. But he didn't answer. I gazed around in total wonderment at the huge room that he had painted once again. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, alive with colors and images. I tried to find a spot of black and white where he still had to fill in color, and could find none. The field of mushrooms with its gnome inhabitants were so real, it felt like I could step into it and join in the merriment of the fairy folk living there. Purple cloud mountains rose up steeply to the left of that, a field of pink cherry blossom trees, sloping downward on the other side, towards a tumbling river, the color of cotton candy. This led into a sprawling desertscape, which started out in yellows, oranges, and golds, and faded softly into the greens and gentle blues of an ocean filled with kelp, octopus, jellyfish, and a myriad of other fascinating aquatic creatures. Gasping, I realized the room was finally complete, my heart thumping in my chest as I thought about what this meant. This had been my Uncle Ivan's life for the past several years, and now it was finished. He should have been reveling in his masterpiece. I thought he would have at least come to find me to show me that it was done. I mean, he knew I was his biggest fan, after all. Where was he? The man was a total recluse, a hermit. He never left the property no matter what, and often spent days straight in the studio, working on the all-encompassing mural. I walked around the fantastical space, becoming lost in the swirling colors, dreamlike images. Even the floors were painted, making it feel like you were completely immersed in this beautiful fantasy world that my uncle had made. The sound of birds chirping came from nearby, and I looked up, surprised, wondering how they could have gotten into the workshop. When I gazed up and I looked around, my heart skipped a beat. And then another. My knees buckled, and I sat down hard, my jaw snapping shut with the impact. Dew-moist grass was beneath me, despite never having left the studio. Strangely, the grass was crimson red, the color of fresh blood. Insects I didn't recognize were scurrying in it, crawling up my arms. They were colorful and otherworldly, leaving rainbow-patterned footprints in their wake. The field of towering mushrooms stood in front of me, and it was actually there. It wasn't just an illusion of perspective and artistic mastery alone. No, I could feel fresh air on my face. I heard birds chirping all around me. There was the sound of a flute playing in the distance ahead, and gnomes were dancing merrily and singing beneath the shade of mushroom-capped roofs. Purple clouds floated in the sky, and a giant eyeball looked down at me like the moon, winking when it saw me. Too scared to scream, I began hyperventilating, terrified. My eyes started to search for an exit, but found no way out. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" a voice asked from nearby. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place where I had heard it from. "I thought you'd like it," my great-uncle Ivan said, reaching out his hand to help me to my feet. "Most people didn't understand what I was doing out here, but I could see that you got it from the very beginning. You knew what the purpose of it all was." Standing on my feet, my terror began to evaporate, and I felt a smile spread across my face. Despite the surreal situation I had found myself in. "Uncle Ivan, you can talk!" It had been so many years since I heard the old man's voice. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. "I can," he said, looking pleased. "At least while I'm here. That's always been the case. Come on, go for a walk." He started ambling towards the mushroom village up ahead. The music of lutes and flutes and drums became louder, the gentle tones of singing voices rising up to greet us. "I miss talking to you, Uncle Ivan," I said after a minute of silent walking. "That's funny. I haven't really said anything yet." We both chuckled at that. Well, it's hard to find someone you're just as comfortable being quiet around as you are talking. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what to say after seeing all this. How long have you been coming to this place? Off and on for about a year. It was more off than on at first. Every time I came across a patch of black and white, it brought me out of it again. But the more I filled in, the longer I got to stay. I thought about this for a minute. It's all the way filled in now. Does that mean... Before I could finish my thought, he interrupted, pointing at the sky and putting his arm around me. Look, Jordan. It's a spectral dragon. That's what I've been calling it anyway. The creature came up over the purple-clouded mountain like the sunrise, then came crashing down the hills towards us, sending a flurry of cherry blossoms fluttering in the air like butterflies. The dragon reminded me of a kaleidoscope, as it morphed into every color of the rainbow before rising up into an air current at the last possible moment, narrowly avoiding crashing into the mushroom forest below, its long, snaking body extending for miles. It was soon lost above us in the clouds. A few moments later, the skyward cherry blossoms fell around us like snow, and continued in that way for a while afterwards, until the ground was pink with them. We kicked them up into the air with our feet as we walked, like fallen leaves in autumn. The gnomes didn't even interrupt their song, as if such things were an everyday occurrence. And I realized they probably were. This place is incredible, I said. No wonder you've been spending so much time out here. Uncle Ivan was smiling and nodding, seeing that I understood him even more now. But there was something off about him. He had lost weight, his face looked skeletal and thin. The change had been so slow I'd barely noticed, since I came out to his workshop pretty much every day, but he previously had chubby cheeks, a belly which overhung his belt. Now those things were gone, and he appeared gaunt and pale. Come, I'll show you my house, he said, laughing and taking my hand. Your house? He led me up the slope towards the mushroom village. The stalks of the fungi had windows and doors carved into them with care, and the quaint community reminded me of the downtown of a small medieval village. There were rustic shops with tables out front, a blacksmith and a market stall with fruits and vegetables. Gnomes were going about their lives in harmony and happiness. In here, Uncle Ivan said, opening the squeaky door at the base of the mushroom. He ducked his head and went inside to the low entry, and I followed after him. Once inside, I saw a tasteful decorated room with furnishings in purple, orange, and gold. There was no indication that we were inside a mushroom. It just looked like a regular house, only circular instead of square. He went over to a large cabinet and began to pull things from his pockets, shoving them inside the drawers. Just a minute. Let me get organized, Uncle Ivan said. He took a large horn beetle from one pocket of his bathrobe and stuffed it into a drawer, and started searching through the other drawers for something. I saw a purple octopus poke its head out of one, and he crammed it back inside. Another drawer sounded like it contained a swarm of bees, while another made a sound like a train whistle and the roar of a locomotive coming down the tracks. Uncle Ivan slammed that one shut quickly as the chugging, rattling noise of an approaching train became so loud it threatened to burst an eardrum. He breathed a sigh of relief, then opened a bottom drawer, retrieving a polka dot umbrella, and unfurled it. A dozen or so frogs fell out of the folds and began hopping around the floor, but he ignored them. Okay, all set. How about some breakfast? The two of us set out on the town and met gnomes on the way to a tea shop. They were singing Uncle Ivan's praises, literally. They had written several songs about him. Most seemed to proclaim him as a savior and a hero, vanquishing an evil enemy which came in the night. What's with the creepy songs? I asked, as we took a seat at a table outside the tea shop. They keep singing about a monster coming in the night. That's not real, is it? I mean, I thought this place was all about peace and beauty. You can't have good without evil, my uncle said, raising his hand to call over a gnome waiter. Yin and yang. You need one to have the other. This place couldn't be what it is without an evil underbelly. For heaven to exist, must be hell after all. Our waiter quickly poured our tea and then hustled away, his eyes fearful and his hand shaking as he overheard our conversation. Another member of the waitstaff brought a platter of biscuits and cakes, and then hurried off as well, looking similarly frightened by the subjects that we were speaking about. Does it always come at night? The monster and the songs? Always. But it's okay. I know how to take care of it. I always protect the villagers here. They need me to protect them. I'm their savior. His eyes looked to be gazing far into the distance past me. I was suddenly worried again for my Uncle Ivan. I took a sip of the tea, but it didn't quench my thirst. I ate one of the cookies as well, but I felt no less hungry afterwards. My uncle ignored all the items in front of us, choosing instead to stare off into the distance. Once again, I remarked to myself how thin he looked. How unwell. Despite the beauty of his creation, despite the absolutely remarkable nature of it all, I was suddenly feeling scared. Not just for my uncle, but for me. I wanted to go home. I wanted to get out of this place. Opening my mouth to speak these thoughts aloud, it suddenly grew dark in the mushroom village and the surrounding fungi forest. A huge black cloud filled with booming thunder was rolling over us, and rain began to pour down, drenching us immediately. Gnomes ran to their houses and slammed their doors and windows shut. Open signs were pulled down from shop windows, and one saying closed replaced them. And yet still my Uncle Ivan stared off into the distance. "Uncle Ivan?" I said, grabbing his shoulder and squeezing it. "Uncle Ivan, are you there?" My heart started pounding faster as his glazed eyes remained fixed on some invisible object in the distance. For a second, I thought that he would stay like that forever. But then he blinked and focused on me again. Oh, sorry. Must have been lost in my thoughts. He looked around and saw the darkness and the rain and stood up quickly. "Dear, oh dear, we should go. Quickly now. Come on, let's get back to the house before it's too late." I thought at first he was talking about going back to the real world and nearly jumped for joy. I followed after him in the pounding rain and splashed through the mud puddles as he led me back to his safe house inside the mushroom. It was only once we were inside that I heard the sounds coming from nearby, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like the floor-shaking approach of a bear or a lion stalking towards us. My uncle grabbed the large wooden plank from behind the couch and brought it over to the door quickly, his eyes wide and fearful. "Help me with this, quickly. They'll be here any second." I hesitated, feeling as if something about this was wrong, but then my fear took over and I grabbed the other end of the wooden board and helped him lay it across the doorway, barricading it. A second later, the door began to pound and shake as something tried to force its way in from outside. It sounded like claws raking across the wood as the thing roared and banged against the entry with all of its might. "The hell is that thing?" I asked my uncle. He was too busy to answer, searching through his large dresser with its countless tiny drawers. "Where is it? Where is it?" he shouted, pulling one open after another. "Must be here. It has to be." I ran over to him, looking back over my shoulder at the door, as it nearly broke in two with the repeated impacts on the outside. Now it sounded like not just one creature, but several, their claws tearing through the wood like paper. "Uncle Ivan, we need to get out of here. They're gonna kill us." As he pulled open one drawer after another, I saw horrors inside each that I'll never forget. The dresser had been full of fun and whimsical items from what I had first seen, but now every drawer he opened had a nightmare inside. A hooded figure reached out with a skeletal arm, a scythe gripped in his bony fist. My uncle slammed the drawer shut before it could emerge. The next had a freakish monster with bulging eyes and squid-like tentacles, which snapped in the air and hissed, with a beaked mouth full of many sharp teeth. He closed that drawer hastily as well. The door we had barred shut began to splinter, and I could see forms through the growing cracks in the wood. It seemed as if one more impact would break it open, and we'd be murdered by whatever came inside to greet us. All darkness, fangs, and claws by the looks of it. My uncle finally found what he was looking for and pulled it out from the dresser drawer, shouting in triumph, "I found it! Let's get the hell out of here!" It was a paintbrush and an easel. He began to paint a picture on the wall beside him, working so quickly it didn't seem possible. A few moments after he had begun, there was a beautiful doorway with a blue sky and sunrise. There were trees and green grassy fields rolling out into the distance. "Come through here," he said, grabbing my arm. I didn't move, though. Something about all of this was wrong, I thought to myself again. Uncle Ivan needed my help, and this wasn't the way to help him. Escaping further into his fantasy world, going one step deeper into this dimension, or whatever this was, it wasn't going to help him. I studied his bony face and looked at his thin, frail hand reaching out to take mine. "Come on, what are you waiting for?" he asked, looking terrified, checking over my shoulder for the next impact from outside. "This isn't the way, Uncle Ivan," I said, realizing what I meant when I said it. "It's not the way home. I need to take you home. You need to eat and drink, and you need to get out of this place for a little while. You can't survive here. You can't live inside this world you created, or it'll kill you. What? No, I can't leave. This is my home now. I need to protect it. The door splintered further with another loud bang as the dark forms forced their weight against the threshold. Do you know what's on the other side of that door, Uncle Ivan? Have you ever waited to see what will come through? Or do you just escape further into your fantasies and run away every time? He hesitated, looking as if he might jump through the doorway without me, escaping into the other world, never to be seen again. But then he turned to look at me and let out a deep, shuddering breath. No, I always run away from it. Suppose I should look at it, though, shouldn't I? We all need to face our fears sometimes, Uncle Ivan, I said, taking his hand. We'll face it together, whatever it is. He gripped my hand tightly, and we stood, waiting for our demise or whatever would come next. With a loud crash, the door broke open, and dark forms in the shape of every alpha predator began to squeeze through, looking like oversized nightmare images of their true selves. Shadowy bodies with no discernible features except for their teeth. Their teeth, which were too long and too sharp, gleaming white. As they closed in on us, I focused on that lack of color and remembered those blank spots in the mural. I thought about home. I braced for the impact and for the teeth which would tear me to shreds. But they never came. When I opened my eyes and I looked up, I saw a wall in front of me with a wolf painted in black and white. It hadn't been filled in yet. A ray of sunshine was peeking in through the doorway which led outside, and I could hear birds chirping out there. We were back in my great-uncle's studio again, and he was beside me, holding my hand, squeezing it very tightly. Both of us let go at the same time, looking at each other and feeling slightly embarrassed for some reason, as if what had just happened hadn't really happened. Looks like you missed a spot after all, I said to my uncle. He looked back at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. Instead, he picked up his paintbrush, which was sitting nearby with an easel. Various colors were there on the board, waiting to be chosen to fill in the empty spots, to make the mural really, truly complete. My uncle went over to the spot with his paintbrush in hand, looking ready to fill in the emptiness. As he picked up the brush, his hand started to shake. Maybe from hunger. Maybe from something else. I laid a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. Why don't you take a break for a little while, huh, Uncle Ivan? Let's go, let's grab a bite to eat. The mural will still be here tomorrow. He turned to look at me and smiled. Then he set the paintbrush and easel down on the floor again. Putting his arm around my shoulder, the two of us walked out from the paint fumes and into the fresh air of the backyard. You know, I said, I was kind of bummed out when I thought the mural was finished. Projects has been such a big part of both of our lives these last few years. Maybe you should leave that one spot blank, you know, like a signature. A reminder of all the time and effort you put in. Here. In the real world. He nodded, his eyes focused and lucid for the first time since I'd seen him that day. Uncle Ivan pointed at a large mountain off in the distance. It took me a second to understand, but I'd always been able to see what he meant in those muted moments. And I did then, too. Yeah, like a landmark. So no matter what, you can always find your way back home. Okay, David Bennett said, putting on his sunniest smile. Hit it, Nige. Nige gave him a 3-finger countdown, and then pressed the record button. Hey, boys and ghouls, Bennett winked into the camera. Here we are, live in the beautiful coastal village of Mavagesi on another adventure, and boy, do we have a great show for you over the coming days. Right here, in this idyllic village, lays a dark secret, a house of murder and madness, known as the Van Draven House. Over the next few days, we here at Ghost Seekers will investigate and infiltrate this infamous house to see what horrors dwell inside. Join us over the next few days, right here on this channel. And remember, darkness dwells within. Cut, Nigel said. We got it, first take and all. Thank God it's not summer. Jenny grinned from where she had sat out of view on a small wooden bench, watching the murky seawater lap at the harbor's concrete sides, a steaming hot chocolate to ward off the growing winter breeze. I heard this place is packed with visitors for most of the year round. Yeah, well, David replied as Nigel packed up the equipment. Looks like the locals get a break every winter. How about we get a drink? Nigel said, eyeing up a nearby pub. I could upload this to YouTube, we could finally get warm. Sounds good, Jenny said, dumping what was left of her hot chocolate in a nearby bin. They have a nice crackling fire by the window. I saw it as we passed. Okay, sounds good, David said, leading the way. Maybe we can get a reaction from some of the locals. I hear they're real touchy about the place. Phones at the ready, he grinned. The pub was called the Lantern, and did indeed have a real open fire, as well as low-hanging beams, soft leather sofas, and a generally welcoming attitude, which surprised David. He was half expecting it to be like that scene from An American Werewolf in London. You know the one, where the two guys walk in and enter the pub, and it goes silent, and the locals all stop and stare. But apart from a few quick glances as they took a seat by the fire, nobody paid them any mind. So, what are we having? David said, reaching for his wallet. Pint of lager for me. Make that too, Jenny said, stripping off her many layers. All right then, David said, crossing the room and leaning heavily on the bar. The barkeep came round, his shirt sleeves rolled up over his muscular forearms. What can I get you? He said in a heavy West Country accent. David ordered and paid, but lingered for a while, sipping his drink, and then dove right in. Excuse me, he said to the big man, who was now polishing glasses with a half-clean dish towel. The man smiled and came back across. Is there anything else? Just a little information, perhaps. Oh, the big man said with a raised eyebrow. What do you want to know? The house, David said, watching the man's face closely. The one on the hill, facing the sea. The man's eyes narrowed. I don't know of any house. David laughed at that. Not any house. Funny that you live in a village full of them, but let's see if I can refresh your memory. House is called the Van Draven House. Me and my friends are investigators. We look into the paranormal and such. My YouTube channel has close to 1 million subs, he said proudly. This story, it's gonna push us right over the threshold. You ain't thinking of going up there, are you? The man said, taking a step backward, his face draining of color, and David was shocked to see a drastic transformation in the man. As a matter of fact, we are. The man muttered something to himself and stalked away, and was soon replaced by a smiling barmaid. What the hell? David said, gathering up his drinks and sitting back down by the fire. You took your time, Nigel said, drinking heavily from his pint. Man could die of thirst. A woman too, Jenny said, sipping at her pint more gingerly. Just trying to gather a little information. You perhaps see how the locals react to our plans. And? Nigel questioned. Well, if the reactions of the barkeep's anything to go by, better keep a low profile. Huh. That bad? Jenny asked, looking concerned. Just then, the door swung open and a tall man strolled in, rubbing his hands together briskly and heading over to the bar. Seeing the man, the barkeep reappeared and poured him a shot of something, which he drank gratefully. They talked for a minute or two, then the tall man came across to where the group was sitting and plonked himself down at their table. Smiling, he took another sip of his drink and waited. David coughed nervously. Can we help you with something? The man sighed and rubbed at his bearded chin that was just starting to show the first flecks of gray, before reaching into his jacket pocket and placing his warrant card face up on the table. The name's Brian Lansbury, Constable Lansbury to you. Nigel scooped up the warrant card and checked the man's ID. Jenny looked over his shoulder before he gently put it back down. So what can I do for you, Constable? David said. We haven't been here long enough to break any laws. Not yet, you haven't. But if you go into that old house, you'll be doing, and I have no problem charging you with the trespass. Now wait a goddamn minute, Jenny said, but David held up a restraining hand, keeping his voice level. From what I know of the house, it's been derelict for some time and has no owner. So how can you accuse us of trespassing? I'll tell you how, because that old place reverted back to the parish council some years ago, and they say that anybody goes into the Van Draven place is trespassing. Now, is that clear enough for you? Besides, what do you kids really want to do up there? You have any idea what's gone on in that house over the years? Do you know how it all started? Lucas Van Draven, David interrupted smoothly, who retired to Mavagassi after his many years in business as a merchant seaman. 2 men died in the building of the house. Later, Lucas himself went insane, killed his wife, Elizabeth, her maid, Matilda, and his manservant, Stevens. There was talk of foul practices, worship to some unclean gods or spirits. Some years later, another man moved in, shipbuilder. His name slips my mind, but not his cause of death. He was found hanging in what was once Lucas Van Draven's study. After that, the house lay empty for some time until the Jonas family moved in and then promptly went missing without a trace. Oh, all their belongings were found, but as for the family itself, gone. Never to be heard from again. Then, in 72, almost 60 years later, another family, the Dorchesters, found in the basement, their bodies torn, twisted, as if by some terrible force. Or, so the story says. And, most recently, the Malones in 2010. 1 man, 1 woman, 2 little girls. It said the father was found in the basement, his family stabbed to pieces and strewn all about him. They later found your predecessor, one Andrew Clutterbuck, who was sent to investigate, hanging from the rafters in an upstairs sewing room. And then there was the 2 village drunks who tried to break into Lucas Van Draven's tomb. 1 missing. Other, now a raving lunatic. Should I go on? He smirked at the constable. I wish you wouldn't, the other man replied, looking a little green. And so you know your history. History of the house. Still, you want to go up there? I do. I intend to record every minute of it, put it online. You see, Constable, I don't believe it. Not a single word of it. Spirits, ghosts, don't exist. But they bring in views. Those idiots on the internet just soak that shit up. Do you know how many so-called haunted houses I've been in? Actually slept in. Me and my crew. I've been pulling this shit off for nearly 5 years. The biggest horror I've seen was a used condom being fought over by 2 rats. There's no ghosts, Constable. Just rumors. Superstitious nonsense presided over by small-minded villagers. Fact is, you can't stop me from going up there. And even if you stop me now, I'll just come back some night a week from now, maybe a month, hell, maybe a year. But I'll get in. Small-minded villagers, huh? The constable said, throwing back his drink before standing and straightening his trousers. You're right, of course. Can't stop you from going up there. I'm only 1 man. I don't intend on getting anywhere near that godforsaken place. Neither will anyone else from the village. But take my advice, he said, eyeing all 3 of them. Give this one a miss. If you value your lives, perhaps even your souls, give this one a hard pass. Or what? Nigel piped in. You'll arrest us when we come out? Constable turned and started heading out the door. Come out, he laughed over his shoulder. Who says you're coming out? With that portent of doom hanging between them, he exited the scene. Did you get all that? David said, turning to Jenny. Sure, she grinned, taking her cell phone from out of her jacket pocket. Audio only, but I got it. Great, he grinned back at her. Nigel, start uploading. Late in the afternoon, they sorted their gear and drove up to Beach Road, where the Van Draven house was located. Nigel carried the recording equipment and lights, while Jenny and David got lumbered with the camping gear. Look at that, Jenny said, as they walked down the abandoned street. Just like on Google Maps. Every one of those houses is empty. You know how much a house in Cornwall with views like that goes for? She said, nodding towards the sea. I mean, the entire road's on a cliff. Look at the views. It goes on for miles. You can almost see the curvature of the earth. Ah, not a flat earther, huh? David grinned. Guy killed his wife on this road. David piped in. Skinned her alive, stitched her skin to a dressmaker's dummy. Guess that and the old house pretty much cleared people out of here. It sure is spooky, though. All those empty houses, he said, walking past yet another dilapidated for sale sign. Constable stories got you quaking in your boots, David laughed. Not me, Nigel replied somewhat waspishly. But I don't see the reason we have to stay the night. Goddamn spiders and mice and the shutters. Don't worry, Nige, Jenny said, throwing a stiff elbow into his ribs. I'll protect you. Well, David said, coming to a sudden stop. Here it is. Van Draven house. The house itself was set a little ways back from the rest of the house. A kind of mini mansion set in its own grounds, with rearing stone walls now falling into despair and covered with clinging ivy. The main gate was black iron, rusting hinges starting to sag. The house itself was in the same poor condition, its roof sagging, its stone walls starting to crumble. The many windows looked out at them with a kind of greedy indifference, and David began to feel almost smothered in its shadow. For a place that's supposed to be off limits, sure as hell ain't done much about it, Jenny said, looking around. No chains on the gate? No boarded up windows? Not even a no trespassing sign. Not anywhere. Remember what the constable said, Nigel replied. About nobody from the village ever coming up here? Guess they don't even have the stones to board up the place. It's like some kind of mass hypnosis, or hysteria, David said, turning to the other two. Hell, we could be doing the village a favor by spending the night here and proving, once and for all, it's only an old house. Nothing to be afraid of. Sure, Jenny said, squeezing between the rusting gates. Bet they'll throw us a parade and everything. That would be great, David grinned, following after her. Maybe even get our faces on the cover of the Cornish Times or whatever shit splat these yokels read. If they can read, Nigel said, passing through the equipment before joining the other two in the leaf-strewn courtyard. Look at these, David said, crossing over to the tall wooden doors and bending down. Those lions? Jenny asked, squatting down beside him. Yeah, look. There's the crest of the Van Dravens. See a clipper ship riding the crest of a wave, and above it, this great eagle carrying a struggling fish. Talk about delusions of grandeur, Nigel said, looking up at the sky. We better get inside, set up before it gets full dark. They set up in a large dining room. The part of the house had been renovated by one of the more recent owners. The floors were smooth, hard wood, the walls replastered. Even these fresher works were now starting to show signs of decay. The rest of the house, however, was like something straight out of a Hammer House horror flick. All peeling plasters, sagging timbers. Even with the windows mostly intact, the house was cold, perhaps colder than it should be. The air stank of rot, age, and bad dreams. Once they were seated, they took a tour around the house. David did his bit, explaining the history of the house for the viewers, while Nigel followed with the camera, Jenny behind him, fussing about the lighting. It was an old routine for them. First, they told the spooky story, the sun setting ominously through the windows. Then they would catch a few hours' sleep and do a live stream in the wee hours of the morning, exiting the house with the coming dawn. It was all very symbolic, and the viewers ate it all up. After they were finished, they went back to the dining room, ate a few snacks, and drank tea from a flask. Nigel smoked one of his many cigarettes while David and Jenny complained and pretended to choke. All that hype, David said, climbing into his sleeping bag. Not a thing. Not even a ghostly moan, a rattling of chains. You sound so disappointed, Jenny said, doing the same. David ignored her and nodded over to Nigel, who was already sound asleep. I guess the mice won't be bothering him any. Haven't seen so much as a single spider. But David said nothing, his breathing already starting to become heavy and deep. Nigel awoke to a sound. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was enough to wake him. The room was now almost pitch black, only lit by a full moon that sailed outside their window. Maybe it wasn't the noise. Maybe it was the ache coming from his full bladder. Tea always made him want to piss, but hey, he was an Englishman. What choice did he really have? With a sigh, he unzipped his sleeping bag, switched off his headlamp, and checked his watch. It was a little after 2 a.m. The others would be up in about an hour, so he moved slowly and quietly, not wanting to disturb them. He was in the hallway now, near the ornate staircase, heading for the front door to relieve himself, when he heard a child's giggle from above him. He stopped in mid-stride, his blood freezing in his veins as he turned, his eyes bugging, his mouth hanging open. There was a little girl on the stairs. She was dressed in 80s attire. "Shh," she whispered to him. "Sissy says we have to be real quiet. Daddy did something bad to Mommy, and Sissy says we have to hide, just like hide and seek." Suddenly, a knife exploded from her chest, blood flowing from her mouth, cascading down her chest, and she turned and grinned at him through bloodied teeth. "Guess he found us. He'll find you too." A disembodied hand shot out of the darkness, grabbed a fistful of her hair, and dragged her screaming back into the shadows. Nigel turned and ran, his bladder letting go, a scream locked behind his chest. He burst back through the dining room door, falling to his knees, trying hard to breathe. David and Jenny were beside him. He felt a sharp pain, and his vision swam back into focus. "Sorry," Jenny said. "I thought you were going to faint. What the hell happened?" "Jesus Christ. It's true. It's all fucking true. I saw her." "Saw who?" David asked. "A girl," Nigel snapped. "A little girl on the stairs. Fuck this," he said, gathering up his equipment. "I'm getting the hell out of here." Wait a goddamn minute," David said, grabbing his arm. "You're telling me you actually saw something in here?" "Didn't I just say so?" Nigel said, shaking free. A girl on the staircase. Somebody stabbed her." "Wait, okay, just wait. David sighed, grabbing up a flashlight and running out of the room. "Don't!" Nigel called after him. But he was already gone, Jenny hot on his heels. "Hold on, David," she called as they entered the hallway. He was on the stairs, flashing his torch all around, but there was nothing. Just years and years of dust and deathly silence. "Think he was playing some kind of trick?" David said, heading back down. "You think a trick made him piss his pants?" Jenny whispered back. "Sleepwalking? Maybe a bad dream," David continued. "Hey, Nige, listen, man," he said, entering the room. But there he stopped. Nigel wasn't there anymore. All his equipment was, even his headlamp still rolling around on the floor as if discarded in a hurry. What the hell? Where did he go? "He didn't come past us," Jenny said, licking her lips nervously. Perhaps he hightailed it through the back door." "Without his camera? You know how much he loves that thing? I mean, okay, fine. I reckon that asshole, he's probably just playing one of his stupid tricks again." "What?" Jenny said. "Without his flashlight. Something is going on, David. Maybe he's having a nervous breakdown or something. Hell, he could still be asleep. He barely said 2 words to us. I've heard of people holding entire conversations while sleepwalking. Some people even drive their car." Okay. So, now what?" David said. "What now? Now we find him and we get the hell out of this place. This feels all wrong to me. It's like the place suddenly woke up or something." "Okay, look, don't get all freaked out on me," David said. "Let's go find him." Grabbing up his flashlight and shrugging into Nigel's discarded jacket, he went into the hall, Jenny hot on his heels. "You take the kitchen, okay? I'll take the study and the library. Meet me back here in 5 minutes, okay? What, are you out of your mind? You know what happens in all those horror movies when people split up?" Jenny said, clawing at his arm. "This isn't a horror story on a stupid YouTube channel, Jenny." David snapped. "The quicker we find him, the quicker we can get out of here, okay? Now, go look." That said, he stomped off, shouting Nigel's name. "Asshole," Jenny muttered, heading towards the back of the house. "Nigel," she whispered, her breath steaming the night air, her hand picking up a slight tremble. She was in a large pantry now that led into the kitchen. Her flashlight picked up a rusty-looking sink, fat droplets of muck-colored water plinking into its chipped, sagging surface. A huge chopping block sat in the middle of the room, gauged and splintered, and tall, rusting shelves with bulging canned goods formed disorienting shadows on her torch. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut. She screamed and spun around, hammering on the door, calling David's name. "Elizabeth," a voice floated out of the darkness. "Is that you, my love?" Jenny turned around slowly, as if in a dream. There was a woman, mostly obscured by darkness. Only her face was clearly visible. She was beautiful, her skin the color of sweet caramel, her voice musical with a hint of the island. "Where have you been, my darling?" She beckoned towards Jenny with one smooth, rounded arm. "Come to me, my love. Let us embrace as we did before." Jenny actually found herself taking a small step forward. The woman was so beautiful, her voice enchanting. Realizing what she was doing, she shook herself and pushed her hard back against the door. The woman frowned and stepped more fully into the light. That's when Jenny began to scream. David spun about. For a moment he thought he heard something, but it sounded far away, as if coming from some long-distant tunnel. "Jesus Christ, Nigel, where the fuck are you?" he said, shining his flashlight over the dusty study, illuminating many torn and tattered books. His flashlight passed over an old ornate desk, but then suddenly flickered back. There was a man sitting there, his clothes ancient and tattered. "Lucas," David gasped, all the air leaving his body, his bowels feeling hot and heavy as he began to shake uncontrollably. "You have to burn it," the apparition beseeched. "We're trapped here. It feeds off us. So many of us now. Burn it." The apparition's eyes widened. "You must go. It's coming." Suddenly, Lucas Van Draven screamed. His body broke out in weeping sores as he began to rot. He was crawling over the desk now, grinning through blackened teeth. "Yes, I feed," it leered, "and I will have you, just like I have your friends. You will know an eternity of torment, locked behind these walls." It was reaching for him now, its skeletal fingers scraping across his jacket, breaking his paralysis. He fled from the room, with great clumsy strides bursting into the hallway where Nigel and Jenny awaited him. "We have to leave, now!" he screamed at them, trying to look everywhere at once. When they didn't move, he trained the flashlight more fully upon them. Nigel grinned at him through the shattered remains of his face. "Still don't believe in ghosts, David. Why don't you stay a while? There's so much more to see." "That's right," Jenny giggled from beside him, her head dangling at an obscene angle. "It's so beautifully dark here, David. We can be together forever." Suddenly, she snarled and lunged for him. He turned to run, but got tangled in his own feet. With a cry, he fell backwards, right out of the front door, and scrambled away as a multitude of grasping hands grabbed at his feet desperately, trying to drag him back inside. Turning, he fled, sure that he was being pursued by some unknown terror, as he lunged through the gate and into the street. He didn't look back, but leapt into the van, slamming the door and locking it tight behind him. Only then did he look. But there was nothing. Only an old house, dilapidated and falling into ruin. He grabbed the key and started up the engine, but then stopped. "You have to burn it," a voice whispered through the recess of his mind. "For the love of God, burn it down." His fear was being replaced now by a smoldering rage. "Fucking house," he snarled. "God-cursed fucking house." Trying hard not to think, he got out of the van. He went to the back. He grabbed up the spare jerry cans of gas. "Okay, motherfucker. Here we go," he growled. Pushing back through the gate, he approached the house, being careful not to get too close. He sloshed the gas through the still open doorway, leaving a trail backwards towards his feet. Thankfully, he was still wearing Nigel's jacket and came up with a Zippo lighter emblazoned with a soaring eagle on its side. "Okay, you son of a bitch," he grinned, flicking open the lighter. "Time to die." That said, he threw the burning flame onto the ground. igniting the gas that roared towards the house. But just as it was about to hit the doorway, it stopped. Defying the laws of physics, the flame suddenly turned and raced back towards him. With a cry, David turned to flee, but it was already too late. The fallen gas can at his side exploded, consuming him in a shower of searing flames. He began to dance and scream as his hair caught fire, and his skin began to melt. The last thing that David Bennett ever saw was the Van Draven house looming above him. The windows filled with smiling faces as they watched him burn. Inside the house, all was quiet. Spiders spun their webs. Mice ran through the decaying walls. A grandfather clock ticked softly. And the house waited and waited and waited. Outside, the crest of Van Draven blazed like a beacon of madness in the soft moonlight. Working as a border patrol agent's a scarier job than most people think, especially during late-night shifts. I worked in an area where there's a lot of action, including smuggling of people, guns, drugs, other illegal materials. There are cartel operations, coyotes, gangs, and lone wolves, everything in between. During these overnight shifts, I was thankful when I had the opportunity for company, even if it was in the form of a Green Guild trainee. Jake was as green as they come. "Quiet night tonight," he was saying, looking out the window shield, desperately hoping for anyone or something to challenge our authority. "So when are we going to see some action?" "You don't want action, kid, trust me. Before the night's done, we'll run into something. This is the witching hour. All the players come out this time of night." "But what if we need to change spots? Maybe they saw us here and..." "Quiet, Jake. You need to keep quiet or you'll give away our location. Nobody knows we're here. If we drive away now, you're gonna spook them. Just watch, learn, okay? There's a reason they put you with me tonight. You wanted your first caller, here's where you're gonna get it." I was struck by a familiar feeling of deja vu. Same scene playing out over and over again in this truck. Maybe one day it'll be different. Maybe one day I get out to retire. He settled down, moping in the passenger seat. The kid didn't understand the job. He didn't know what it was like to sit out here alone, surrounded by desert hills with no backup for miles and miles. These old cliffs and low mountains were dotted with mine shafts and tunnels, blasted out of the sand and stone long before we were born, and they afforded plenty of places to hide. There were people who wanted us dead out here in the desert. They could be glad to have the chance to make that happen. One spot in particular caught my eye. At the same time, Jake noticed it. "Hey, do you see that light?" "No." "Look right up there," he pointed. Right next to my face, his index finger indicating an obvious orb of light. "Nope, don't see anything." "You know what? Maybe we should move after all." He jerked his head down as if afraid of being spotted. "They're looking right at us, I think." "No, it doesn't look like they can see us." "Of course not," I thought to myself, because this is a good spot to hide. That's why I come here. "How many are there?" I asked, resigning to the fact that this was happening now. We're gonna pursue him, or at least he was gonna pursue him. "Looks like 2, maybe 3 at most. Smugglers, by the look of it." "Okay," I said. "Then don't go doing anything stupid. Just stay put. Let me call it in. We'll get backup out here." "They'll be gone by the time they arrive. Come on, the 2 of us should stop them." He cracked open his window slowly, then got out. I had the interior lights rigged to stay dim so that it wouldn't give away our location to anyone. He closed his door as silently as he could, the soft sound of metal clicking back into place indicating he was really leaving. I just sighed, knowing how this is going to go. It always seemed to go the same way. The deja vu feeling struck again, but only for a second as I ran to catch up with the kid. "Slow down. You need to stay hidden for an approach like this. We're too out in the open." He ignored me, continuing his trajectory as if I wasn't even there with him. "I'm trying to help you. Listen to me. You're going to get yourself killed." He kept marching stubbornly forward, and I saw, where he was headed. One of the black holes cut out in the face of the mountain was straight ahead, an old mine shaft that had been out of use for decades. "They're heading for the tunnel. We need to cut them off before they get there," he said, like a character in a play who's committed to saying the lines that he had rehearsed, despite the improvisations of the other cast members. His breath was growing labored. He sounded like he was getting winded already. He hadn't even started chasing anyone yet. Adrenaline can give you a lot of strength and speed, but it doesn't last long. And when that endorphin rush is over, you're more tired than you'd normally be. And that's why I try to stay calm in situations like this, but I didn't have time to teach him that lesson yet. We finally reached the doorway to the mine shaft after a long, long hike. The smugglers he had seen had made it there a few minutes before us and had given no indication of noticing our paths towards them. Still, I got the feeling they knew that we were coming. Despite my years on border patrol, they knew this desert a hell of a lot better than us. "Okay, what's next, boss?" Jake said, looking at me as we stood outside the tunnel entrance. "It's not up to me, Jake. You already made this decision for yourself. I told you we needed backup. You didn't listen." "Oh, come on, man. Just think about how excited everyone at the station's going to be when they see that we caught these guys by ourselves. They probably have a bunch of cocaine or heroin or something. We'll be heroes." "Don't do it, kid. Kid, please. Just listen to me." He didn't listen. Instead, he went straight inside the tunnel, and I stupidly followed after him. We kept our flashlights off, moving towards the sound of voices echoing in the distance. It sounded like two men having a conversation. They were laughing and joking, and I could hear glasses clinking as if they were celebrating something with a toast. "We got him, man," Jake whispered with his gun drawn. I could see his hands trembling, his legs wobbly with each nervous step that he took forward. The sounds of their voices grew louder as we drew closer. With each step, I felt more certain of what would happen next. Like a jump scare in a horror movie. I knew it was coming, but I didn't know exactly when. And then, it really did begin to play out like a movie. We rounded the corner to find two men sitting in front of a small fire. They were drinking and laughing, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, which were clenched in their yellowed fingers. "Hands up! Get him up now! Border Patrol, you're both under arrest!" Jake was yelling at the two men as they put their hands in the air, cigarettes dangling from their lower lips, and looked particularly worried. "Under arrest? For what?" one of them asked in broken English. "We're just camping here. You Americans have laws against camping?" Jake's gun began to lower slightly, as if he was taken aback by the question. But a second later, he raised it at their heads again, as if remembering who he was and what we were doing out here. "You two came across the border illegally. I saw it. Now I'm guessing those two bags you were carrying, that you had something with you. Something heavy." "What bags? You see any bags?" The two men were looking at him as if he was an idiot. And Jake looked uncertain again. "And there was another man, Jake. You said 2 or 3 of them, remember?" He didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he went towards the two men, getting within arm's reach of both. Alarm bells began to ring in my mind as I thought about the danger he was putting himself in. Then the other man emerged from the side tunnel, his gun raised. "Drop it!" Jake yelled. They were the last words from his mouth. 3 loud shots rang out in the tunnel, their echoes reverberating painfully and piercing my ears until it felt like my eardrums would explode. Jake was on the ground a moment later, bleeding out, his blood so dark in the dim light that it appeared almost black, the crude oil leaking from the floor beneath him. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice said. Another shot rang out. I felt a hollow ache in my gut, an emptiness where the bullet had been. I remembered falling to the floor in that exact spot where I stood now. I remembered the pain of the shot, now just a distant memory. The voices of the men fleeing in the tunnel were loud at first, and then grew quieter as they disappeared into the distance. My heart was thumping fast as I looked down at Jake, the blood pouring out of his mouth, dribbling down his chin as he coughed and sputtered, saying, "Sorry, boss. Should have listened to you." "It's okay, kid. It's gonna be okay. You're gonna make it. I promise. You're gonna see your mom again, just like I promised her this morning. I'm gonna take care of you." My voice trailed off as his breathing slowed, then stopped. One more ragged, crackling inhalation could be heard as he tried desperately to fight off death. The exhale came wet and bubbling. There was nothing else after that. He was dead. I left him there. As I walked back towards the truck through the darkness of the desert, I couldn't help but lift my shirt at the bottom, fingering the scar where the bullet had gone in. All these years later, I was still there, like a trophy, souvenir or something awful. The truck was up on the hill, dim and quiet. I marched towards it again. I got in and caught my breath as I sat down. Memories of what I'd seen played out in my mind. Everything's so real I can practically reach out and touch it. I just wished I could forget those memories. Wish I didn't have to relive them over and over again. Wish I didn't have to see all my mistakes. All the things I could have done better. The ways I could have saved him over and over, replaying like a movie I'd seen 1,000 times before. The stories of this area, the deserts, plentiful. There's a lot of action that happens around here, and I don't just mean illegal border crossings. There's another border we seem to share, and lines are blurred at this time of night between the world of the living and the world of the dead. More than one Border Patrol agent has told me that they've seen ghosts in that exact spot. A lot of them describe him as the same person. A young recruit who looks eager and ready for duty. He's a bit green around the gills, but he's clearly motivated. Wanting to do good, wants to help people. Guess I'm the one who sees him the most, though. Which is fitting, since I'm the one who his mother blamed for his death. A chill ran down my spine as I felt eyes watching me from the passenger seat. Saw a flash of white light appear beside me. Fear gripped me anew. Even though I like to pretend this was all normal, it didn't get any less terrifying when it happened. Still, I felt like I owed it to Jake to give him a little taste of real life again, even if it was repetitious. Like a movie being played on a loop over and over again. Usually he didn't make 2 visits in one night, but tonight was special. It was the anniversary, and it was the witching hour. That time of night when the veil gets so thin you can see right through it. And you can reach out and touch what's on the other side. Quiet night tonight, Jake said from the seat next to me. So, when are we going to get to see some action? The fire was gluttonous that night. She watched from the window of her apartment building as it devoured the small 2-story home just a few blocks away. It ate away at the roof and gable that licked the insides clean with glowing orange tongues. It roared with laughter as it gorged itself, then belched black smoke into the sky. Sirens wailed through the air, the desperate cries of emergency vehicles that would never make it to the scene. Not until the glutton had its fill. When all that remained would be the home's charred black skeleton and the twisted, scorched bodies of the family who once lived there. Only then, when there was nothing left to save, would the barricades be removed and the fire engines and ambulances be allowed passage. On the street below, she could hear cheering. In the distance, gunshots. Another night devolved into chaos. By morning, the streets would be quiet and the house would be nothing but a pile of smoldering ashes. But tonight, carnage would reign. Such was life in the autonomous zone. It hadn't always been that way. There was a time not long ago when lynch mobs didn't rule the night and people weren't always looking over their shoulder. But that had changed with one anonymous post on an internet message board. They pretend to be us, but they are not us. Beware the imitators. When it first popped up, most considered it to be nonsense, a meme people reposted on social media when it didn't have anything important to say. But within a week, it was reblogged around the internet millions of times. The word imitators trickled its way into office water cooler talk and conversations around the family dinner table. It wasn't long before people began to profit off of it. Entrepreneurs looking to make a quick buck started printing up t-shirts and coffee mugs with "Beware the Imitators" written on them. As it rose in popularity, some began taking it more serious, even asking questions in an effort to decode the cryptic message. Who are the imitators? What do they want? Online communities gathered on forums where users argued over every nuance of the post's words. Podcasts were next, as conspiracy theorists spread their thoughts on the subject to millions of curious listeners. 2 months after the strange warning was originally posted, a shocking survey was published by a national research institute, stating that 12% of the US population believed that the imitators were a real threat to the country. Even if no one could agree on what it was, they even were. Major media outlets were quick to capitalize on hysteria, and within days, talking heads were alluding to it on TV. Soon the news was reporting on physical altercations between paranoid people accusing each other of being imitators, and by summer, politicians were referencing the post directly at their rallies. A second study published in the fall confirmed that the numbers of true believers had more than tripled. Tensions boiled over. Things got out of hand when a man in Columbus strangled his wife and daughter because he thought they had been replaced with imitators. Shortly after, a disturbed young man wearing body armor and carrying an AR-15 was arrested for opening fire in a crowded shopping center. He gunned down 15 people before being apprehended. When his manifesto was recovered by police, it was revealed that he believed the mall was being used as an imitator breeding ground. Protests erupted across the U.S. Confrontations with the police became violent and deadly, and soon, people were rioting. The ensuing chaos allowed bad actors a chance to move in, set up shop in urban neighborhoods where they secured strongholds, and once that happened, things got even uglier. She wondered how many people were killed during tonight's madness as she looked on through the window. Perhaps it wasn't worth thinking about. Her focus softened to her own reflection, and she let out a sigh of disgust. What an old crone, she thought. She had the face of a hag, thin gray hair and eyes like ice. Her skin sagged off of her neck like a turkey's waddle, and from the side her long, gaunt frame and rounded shoulders were reminiscent of a shepherd's crook. She hid her form beneath a baggy black nightgown, but her legs, pale and speckled with liver spots, peeked out from under the bottom of her skirt. She fantasized about what it would be like to have the body of a younger woman. What it would be like to look pretty. A faint noise broke her from her daydream. The sound had risen from just beyond her apartment's door, then faded almost as quickly as it arrived. She looked at the clock. It was 11, past curfew. But perhaps one of her neighbors had just returned from taking part in tonight's festivities. Still, what she had heard hadn't been the jingle of keys or the echo of footsteps. It had been something else. A voice, maybe. One she didn't recognize. She craned her neck, wondering if she had imagined it. But a few moments later, she heard the sound again. A soft whimpering. And this time she was sure it was coming from the hallway. She trapezed slowly across the living room, past her tiny kitchen, keeping her ear to the air as if losing the sound would suddenly cause the mystery to vanish. When she got to the flimsy composite wood door that separated her unit from the hall, she leaned against it and listened, careful not to make a noise so as not to alert whoever was on the other side. It was undeniable now. Someone was crying in the hallway. A woman or a young child, from the sound of it. She told herself not to check, that doing so would be inviting trouble into her life, but her fingers moved as if they had a mind of their own. A slave to her hands, she watched with dread as they turned the lock, twisted the knob, and pulled. The next thing she knew, her door was open, exposing her to whatever was waiting on the other side. Cautiously, she leaned her head into the hall and scanned her surroundings. 2 doors down was a boy and girl huddled together against the wall. They looked like siblings. The boy, dark-skinned and skinny, couldn't have been older than 10, and the little girl he was clutching to his chest was barely old enough to start kindergarten. There were tears in their eyes. She buried her face into her brother's shoulder and let off a soft sob. So the mystery had been solved. But their appearance only raised further questions. Their skin and hair were smeared with dirt, and their pajamas were tattered and filthy. They were shoeless, their feet caked in grime, and she could see the boys' heels had been cut and were bleeding. It seemed they had been walking barefoot through the city streets for a while. It was unsafe to be outside of your home past curfew. There was no telling what might happen if you were spotted by the wrong person, so the children were a peculiar sight. The hallway was empty save for them, but she couldn't help but feel a strange electricity in the air, zipping and buzzing all around as though an invisible semiconductor was about to explode. "Psst," she hissed. The boy snapped his head her way, then recoiled like a frightened animal, but she raised her palms to let him know she meant no harm. "You don't live here," she said. It had come out more of an accusation than a question. The boy shook his head. She glanced quickly over his shoulder just to make sure none of the neighbors had stepped out to investigate, then waved the children over. "Inside, then," she said, pointing to her apartment. "Hurry!" The boy stood and helped his sister to her feet. Perhaps not sensing the urgency, they shuffled slowly past her and into her home. She thought she must have looked like an old witch in that moment, beckoning poor Hansel and Gretel into her house for delight. Only this time, there was no gingerbread or candy to entice them, just dusty rugs and antique furniture, ancient magazines and drapes that smelled like cigarettes. She sat them at the kitchen table so that she could gather her thoughts. Now, up close, the children looked even more ragged than before. It wasn't dirt that they were covered in, it was soot. And this revelation made her even more uneasy. They had been at the fire. The children stared at her, blank expressions on their faces, and she wondered why it was so challenging to get a read on them. "Are you injured?" she asked. They said nothing. "Where are your parents?" But again, she was met with silence. Frustrated, she blurted out, "Where do you live?" Once more, the children stayed quiet, but this question had at least gotten the little boy to stir in his seat. He turned and raised his hand, then extended a finger. She followed it, and realized he was pointing towards the window. Through the glass, the glutton continued to feast, a blazing inferno, burning brighter, more intense than ever. It looked like it would never die. So it was their house then. They hadn't just been there, they had been the targets. How had they escaped? Desperate to put an end to the madness, she dashed across the living room, then jerked the curtains closed. She had known, at least a part of her had known, that these kids were somehow victims of that awful fire. But this had confirmed it. They were in shock. That was why they weren't talking. But she didn't have time to coddle them, no. She had to coax the kids through this trauma as quickly as possible. They would be in danger if they couldn't snap to their senses soon, and that meant she would be in danger too. She put a kettle on the stove and rummaged through her pantry, looking for something the children might like to eat. She settled on a bag of butterscotch candies. When the kettle began to whistle, she poured the 2 cups of tea and served it to them alongside the sweets. "Careful, it's hot," she warned. But the children did not even attempt to sip it. Instead, they just stared. 2 sets of unblinking eyes, looking back at their teacups, steamed in front of them, and she wondered if there was anything she could do that would break them from their haze. There was a sudden clamor outside of her apartment, the thunder of steel-toed boots storming down the hallway. She scurried back to her door. She cracked it and stuck her head out just enough to see a dozen men wearing paramilitary uniforms and carrying guns were now occupying her building. They had already begun knocking on her neighbors' doors and were working their way down the hall. On each of their arms, they wore a patch that read SFF. She recognized the insignia. Sons of the Founding Fathers. The militia had moved in, armed to the teeth, and at least 100 strong, when the riots had gotten bad. They had been organized, part of a bigger movement that had enacted similar strategies with various degrees of success across the country. With the help of protesters and supporters, they managed to barricade the streets and set up a perimeter around the neighborhood that the cops had been too afraid to breach. It had been easy. People lost faith in the government, and the SFF were promising to restore order once and for all. They would do this, they declared, by rooting out any imitators that were hiding out in the newly declared autonomous zone, masquerading as humans. The peace and order never came, but blood certainly did, and with each person accused and executed, the SFF gained more support in the community. It didn't matter if they had yet to prove that anyone they had killed had in fact been an imitator. All that mattered was that they were doing something, taking action, and the blood they spilled made their supporters feel safe, so long as they weren't caught in their crosshairs. She locked the door again. It was clear who the SFF were looking for. The children were still statuesque, but even the sounds of their pursuers had broken them from their trance. She snatched them by the wrists and whisked them into the bedroom, where she searched wearily for a place to hide them. The room was bare, just a bed and an old armoire. Neither of these would do. They'd be the first places the militia would look if they forced their way into her apartment. Her eyes fell to the connected bathroom. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option she had. There was a knock from the other side. The SFF were already at her apartment. They were being polite for now, but if she lingered too long, they would stop knocking on the door and start trying to break it down. "Wait here," she whispered to the children, then darted to the bathroom. She drew the shower curtain closed, then reappeared in the doorway and coaxed the children towards her. The cabinet beneath the sink was small and cramped, but the kids fit snugly inside. The knocking persisted, louder and more forceful this time. The men at her doorway were losing their patience. "Don't move or make a sound," she said to the kids. She shut the cabinet, shrouding them in darkness. "I'll tell you when it's safe to come out, understand?" The children didn't respond. She would have been surprised if they did, but a part of her had hoped for confirmation that they heard her. "Hang on, I'm coming," she shouted as she hurried back to the front of her apartment. She was in control of her fingers this time. She turned the lock slow and deliberately. Time was valuable to her, and every second she could buy was another second she could use to collect her bearings. Two men in uniform greeted her when she opened the door. The man in the front was short. Right away she noticed the gun on his hip, and the rifle slung over his shoulder. He wore a hat with the SFF insignia on it, the bill of which pulled down low on his forehead. On the front of his fatigues was a patch. The name read Edwards. Behind him was a man who was built like a mountain, tall, barrel-chested, and broad at the shoulders. He stood rigidly, peering over the head of his compatriot, a nasty grimace on his face. He sported a military buzz, and had a jaw so sharp it could cut glass. But she could tell, just by the look of him, that there wasn't much going on behind his eyes. He snarled menacingly at her, but despite his fierce demeanor, she preferred it to the face of the shorter man. Edwards was smiling cordially, but he wore that grin like a cheap Halloween mask. Beneath it, she could tell, lurked something sinister. "Sorry to bother you, miss," said Edwards, "but we're here representing the sons of founding fa—" "I know who you are," she snapped. "What I want to know is what you're doing at my door past curfew." Her response had temporarily broken the man from the character he was playing, and for a brief moment his face flashed the viciousness that he'd been hiding. She had challenged him, and he didn't like that, but she also knew he had bigger fish to fry. Slowly, as if he had unconsciously willed it, the courteous grin returned. "About that. Well, miss," his voice had lowered as though he were sharing a secret, "we don't mean to alarm you, but we've tracked a pair of dangerous imitators to this building. We're currently doing a sweep, going door to door asking the residents if they've seen anything suspicious." "Only thing I've seen tonight is the inside of my eyelids," she said. "You woke me up. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to bed." Edwards nodded. "Hey, perhaps there's the man of the house," he asked. "He might be more helpful in this situation." He recognized that was intended as a shot at her, but she paid it no mind. "Sorry," she said. "I live alone. Good night." She closed the door in the men's faces and twisted the lock hard enough for them to hear it. The apartment was quiet. She rushed back to the bathroom and flipped on the light. Then called out to the children, but heard nothing. Something wasn't right about the room. It took her a moment to realize the shower curtain above the bathtub had been opened. On instinct, she rushed over and drew it quickly. She turned back to the sink and reached towards the cabinet. "Are you there, children?" she asked in the sweetest voice she could muster. The loud knock at her front door caused her to stop in her tracks. "Shit," she muttered. Again, she hurried back across the apartment. When she opened the door this time, most of the militia was filing out of the hallway towards the stairwell, presumably to sweep another floor. Edwards and his behemoth, however, were still there, and it was clear they hadn't moved since she had closed the door on them a minute prior. "What is it this time?" she asked. "So sorry to bother you again, miss," said Edwards. He was still wearing that mask, still putting on his faux air of courtesy. What she hated most about it was that she wasn't sure if he wanted her to see through it. She wanted to follow up and ask you again. "Are you sure you live alone?" She said nothing for a long moment, eyes studying them, trying to decide what his game was, until finally she forced a reply. "Why would you ask me that?" Edward's lips curled at the corner. His mask was ready to crumble, and he couldn't wait for it to come off. His eyes trailed over her shoulder towards the kitchen table. "Well, it's just that you got 2 cups of tea on your table, and I find it mighty odd that a woman who lives alone would have poured herself 2 cups of tea, wouldn't you? I was about to ask you about that before you so curtly slammed your door in our faces." She twisted around and gawked at the mugs. Everything had happened so fast that she'd forgotten to get rid of them. When she turned back towards the men, Edward's mask was completely gone. His smile had stretched wider, but it was his true smile now, mischievous and toothy. A devil's grin. His eyes no longer carried the fake concern that they did before. Now they bore down upon her like the glare of a predator. "I know you won't mind if my friend and I come in and look around," he said, a perverse lilt in his voice. "I'm sorry, but I do mind," she replied. She tried to close the door again, but this time it didn't budge. She looked down to see that Edwards had placed his boot between the door and the frame. "I don't think you understand," he said. There it was. The transformation in his voice was now complete. The real Edwards had shown himself completely, a vindictive, vile little man who would not take no for an answer. "I'm not asking." The larger man grunted, and she backed away from the door. A second later, both were inside her apartment. "Check the kitchen first, Smith," ordered Edwards. Pots and pans clattered to the ground as the tall, brawny man, who she now knew was named Smith, began to rummage through the pantry. He tossed plates to the tile floor, shattering them with little remorse and knocking anything off the counter that was in his way. By the time he was done, the ground was littered with food, shards of ceramic, and broken glassware. He moved to the living room next and flipped over the couch. "This is ridiculous," she protested. "You're ruining my home! You aren't the police!" Edwards grabbed her by the arm and scowled. It was clear that he was out for blood, and one way or another, children or no children, he was going to have it. "This is a national emergency. The police can't be trusted." And when he said that, he squeezed her arm so tight, she knew he was trying to leave his fingerprints on her skin. "The imitators have infiltrated the police department. They've infiltrated the government. You're a bunch of scared idiots, parroting absurd campfire stories," she said. "Grown men who'd rather play G.I. Joe and blame your shitty lives on some made-up boogeyman than admit that you're the problem." Edward's sneer twisted at her retort. Seemed as if he was about to say something, but Smith had already finished searching the living room and was waiting for further instructions. He leaned in close, and she could smell a hint of booze on his breath. "Last chance." "Where are they?" he demanded. "If you don't tell us, you'll be tried as an accomplice." She bade him no reply. He yanked her towards the bedroom, and the larger man followed. The three of them stood in the doorway for a second as Edwards tried to decide on where to search next. He motioned to the bed, so the subordinate got down on his hands and knees, shining his flashlight. "You can look all you want, but you're not going to find any imitators here," said the old woman. "Not under the bed, not in the armoire, not in the—" "Enough!" Edward shouted. He threw the old woman to the floor and stood over her, then unfastened the holster of his gun. "So sick of your voice!" It was then the bathroom door caught his eye. He flashed the woman an arrogant smirk, then nodded his head towards the door. "Smith, in there." The massive man lumbered up from the ground and stomped through the doorway, making a beeline straight for the cabinet. Her eyes widened, wondering what the men would do if they found the kids. Smith reached a clumsy hand towards the cabinet door beneath the sink, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. With a quick jerk, he flung the doors open. It wasn't until he stepped aside that she could see that the cabinet was empty. "Is there anywhere else they could be hiding?" asked Edwards. His lapdog turned to his 9 o'clock, and she knew he was looking at the shower. It was the next logical spot that he could search. He wouldn't find them there, not the children. That she was positive of. "So what do you think they are?" asked the woman. She was still on the bedroom floor, but Edward was surprised to see that she was smiling up at him. "What?" "The imitators. Some think they're demons. Some say space aliens. I once read an article that said that they were a subterranean species that's lived under the earth for thousands of years. I'm just curious, which ridiculous theory do you buy into?" Edwards grimaced. "Doesn't matter. What matters is they're waging a secret war. Our country is under attack." "The country's under attack, all right. But from people like you. You don't care that you haven't seen one, do you? You don't even care if they're real as long as you can swing your big gun around because it makes you feel like a man." Edwards placed his hand on the butt of his gun. "Just so you know, it's SFF policy to terminate citizens aiding and abetting imitators. But even if it wasn't, I don't think I'd be able to resist putting a bullet between your eyes." It was hard to say if he was playing with her, but he sounded serious enough. She never found out if Edwards was bluffing or not, because before he had a chance to make good on his threat, a scream ripped through the apartment. It was a sharp, ear-splitting shriek, and it caused the little man's head to snap towards the bathroom just in time to see Smith stumble backwards past the doorway, trip over the toilet, and crash into the wall. Whatever he had seen in the shower had shaken him. He pulled his knees into his chest and began rocking back and forth, murmuring incoherently to himself. "The hell's gotten into you?" shouted Edwards. He reached down and snagged the woman by the arm, jerking her to her feet, then dragging her to the bathroom. "By the authority of the sons of the founding fathers," he droned, "I hereby placing you under arrest. You have the right to remain—" He stopped short once he saw the shower, drew in a sharp breath, and whispered, "Holy shit." The corpse sat propped up in the tub. At a glance, it looked like an anatomy dummy, but the dry blood caked across the bottom of the basin, and the brown handprints smeared along the walls had dispelled the notion quickly. The corpse's skin had been removed by what appeared to be the delicate hands of a surgeon, shucked right off in fell swoops. The rest of the body, however, was perfectly intact. It was a female cadaver, as evident from the glandular and fibrous tissue sagging from the chest where the breast would be. But aside from that, it was near impossible to make out any other distinguishing details. Edwards began to tremble as he took in the sight, unsure how to process it. In fact, he had become so possessed by the abomination in the bathtub, he hadn't noticed the old woman's arm beginning to writhe in his grip. Her arm was moving, not as if she was wriggling it free, but as if something was wriggling inside. "You were looking for imitators?" The words came from behind him. It sounded like the old woman had been joined by an infernal choir, 1,000 gravelly voices all speaking together in unison. "Well, you found one." The larger man scrambled to his feet and broke for the door, but hadn't made it 2 steps before a black appendage shot from the old woman's back and wrapped itself around his waist. He pulled against the doorframe, struggling to free himself as the tentacles slithered up his body like a snake. Smith opened his mouth to scream, but only a pained wince managed to squeak out. The tentacle coiled around his body like a boa constrictor and began to squeeze. Edwards cringed at the sound of his subordinate's ribs snapping and splintering beneath the force of its grip. Blood began to leak from Smith's mouth, followed by what appeared to be organs, as his eyes bulged and his face turned a pale shade of blue. A few seconds later, it dropped him, and he hit the floor with a thud. Vertebrae crushed, heart collapsed inside what was left of his chest. Edwards gaped at Smith's mangled body, which just a few minutes earlier he thought was near invulnerable. Realization set in, and his eyes trailed up from the corpse to the old woman. Things were now squirming beneath her skin, and her flesh reminded him of a bag of night crawlers. He let out a frightened squeal, releasing her arm and then reaching for the gun on his hip. but a second appendage shot from her chest, tearing a hole through her nightgown and snagging his wrist. It was here that he realized it wasn't a tentacle at all, not like one would see on a squid. The appendage was comprised of what appeared to be leeches or slugs, thousands of them, black and shiny, all moving together in unison like a school of fish. They felt cold and slick against his skin. He tried to pull free, but every time he moved his arms, the leeches spun around his wrists, tightening their grip. You're one of them, Edward shuddered. An imaging... Before he could finish, another appendage had split off from the one holding onto him and ensnared his throat. He began to choke. He tipped him backwards so that his head was hanging over the edge of the bathtub. Don't worry. I'm not going to strangle you, said the woman. She no longer looked like a woman at all. All of her features were present, but they moved fluidly around her face as she spoke, wriggling and gesticulating, eyes drooping and rising up her cheeks, lips wandering across her forehead. She had become a slithering sack of flesh. One of the slugs had broken off from the tendrils around Edward's throat and was squirming its way up his face, leaving a trail of slime across his chin and lips. It stopped and perched on the bridge of his nose, and then raised itself up so he could get a good look at its underside. The thing's puckered mouth began to expand, and from it extended a white, needle-like projection. I'm going to take your skin, and I want you to feel every second of it. The creatures on Edward's face screeched and buried its spike between his eyes. He felt a terrible sting, and then a hot searing pain as it dragged itself inch by inch down the center of his body, splitting his flesh in two. It took only a few minutes to remove his skin. He wasn't even dead by the time she discarded his raw, fleshy, stripped body into the bathtub. In fact, Edwards would lie there for some time, quivering in a ball at the bottom of the tub, staring at his own flesh piled on the floor, before death finally took him. She took pleasure in his final exhale. His skin would do just fine. He wasn't a young woman, like she wanted, but imitating a ranking member of the militia would make it easier to slip out of the autonomous zone. A soft whimper from the bedroom had caught her attention. She twisted her head around like an owl, and her eyes fell on the armoire, where she could see a pair of shadows shifting through the cracks in the door. The children had seen too much. Her body writhed as she slinked towards the cabinet, tendrils trailing behind her and dancing through the air like enchanted serpents. Children, you can come out, she said, reaching for the door, no longer bothering to mask her voice. It's safe now. The following recordings are part of the Daedalus operation, a top-secret experiment taking place in authorized by. Only authorized members may listen to these files. 400 hours. We have arrived at the testing site. The others seem pretty upbeat, but I don't share their feelings. It's not my first choice, hardly even my last choice, if I'm being honest. I was assigned here because I've had issues with authority, kicked to the bottom of the totem pole, and given the most grueling of tasks in hopes that I will eventually resign or wind up killing myself. The assignment my former commanding officer told me was where good men went to die. Don't be deceived into thinking you're ready for what's going to happen here. You aren't. And you never will be. Actually, I took those words to heart as I passed through the triple layer of security and took a moment to calm my heart with a quick smoke. Not the best of habits, I know. But I'd also been told that anything outside the quarantine zone wasn't going to be allowed in. All my personal effects, memories of my time serving the military, even the picture of my girlfriend would be left behind. Someone told me that it wasn't too late for me to run and hide. My new boss, a nerfed merc named Roland Matthias, he was either East European or Mediterranean, but he looked like he was the type that meant business. Probably seen twice as many battles as me. He was counting inventory as his soldiers set up base camp, and a senior communications officer was explaining how we'd be able to transmit anything from the other side once we went through. So, this is for real? I asked, recalling the bizarre way the mission had been described when I had been told that I was headed to this godforsaken place. The file was thin. It claimed that the building we were now entering had experienced an incident relating to an experiment only about 5 months ago. Since that time, 4 teams had attempted to discern what had happened. None had returned successfully. According to the last transmission, there were large fluctuations in radio waves and electromagnetism. There's a wall of noise, a glitch in the very fabric of our reality. Squad had come to call this zone as a liminal gateway. The only footage we had obtained from the other side showed drab corridors that went on forever, fluorescent lights that hardly provided any illumination at all, and a sense of emptiness that filled anyone who watched the media with a sense of dread. When I saw the report, I had assumed it was some sort of sick joke, or a confusion in the mission statement. But now, as we prepared to barge into the abandoned building, acting as though it was a battle zone, I realized this was more dangerous than anyone had imagined. They told me to get my suit on and be ready to move out in 1 hour. I took the time to call my girlfriend. She didn't even know about my assignment and wasn't entirely sure how to explain it. Thankfully, I only got her voicemail, so I made it quick. Hey, it's me. I'm on the field again, just like you wanted. I'm about to head out, but I wanted to make sure you're doing okay. Now, we haven't had much time to talk, but I think I'd like to change that. Once this is over, I can just come home. Hell, I wish I could now. I wish I could just run into your arms. The message beeped and I cursed myself, realizing I didn't have enough time to say all the things I wanted to say. I've made so many mistakes to wind up here. My superiors likely wanted me to enter this building and never return. I suited up, took a deep breath. It's time to prove them wrong. 500 hours. I told myself as Matthias finished getting the others ready, I'd do my best to familiarize myself with the names of my fellow comrades. We were but a skeleton crew meant to only investigate as much as possible, report back to HQ, but it was soon very clear that I wasn't the only one here who had been sent to be forgotten. Vincent Carter, team's physician, said that he'd been given the assignment after a botched surgery in Boston. Mr. Lang said there were 2 sisters that needed my assistance. Now, I was on holiday near Evergrove anyway. Tried to save them, but honestly, he'd called me too late. He didn't like that, given the fact that I had alcohol in my breath. Well, I don't have to tell you what happened next, he told me, gesturing aimlessly to the entrance of the abandoned building. I was focusing on the darkness and thinking back to the footage I had seen, asking aloud to Commander Roland, where does the power source come from? Apparently it was one of many questions that needed to be answered. Weatherby and an analyst that seemed close to Roland was helping to set up a tethering system. All of us would be interconnected to one another via simple pulleys and ropes, as though we were planning a spelunking expedition. It's easy to get lost in there. Make sure you don't lose sight of one another, Weatherby advised all of us. An older soldier that looked like he should already be past retirement barked a complaint as the analyst finished the hooks on the ropes and gave me a gruff look. I immediately noticed that he had a long scar running along the left side of his face, along with a glass orb where his eyes had once been. The older man asked if I had something to bother him with. Commander Matthias told us to send out any messages to family or friends in the event that we don't return. Didn't see you doing that, I commented, as he walked towards the darkness. Nobody out here left for me. Only the shadows are my comfort now, he said, spitting on the ground. Yes, surely there must be someone. He turned and jabbed a finger in my chest, angry that I was still pressing the issue. I said there was no one. Leave it at that. I belong here, the old man growled. I stood in place for a moment, confused by his words as Vincent explained that Marsh was the only one that volunteered. He didn't know why. There were rumors, of course, but nothing solid. I shook off the unease and nodded, activating the light on my helmet, followed the others inside. Matthias was nearing the east wall, setting up small rectangular boxes on the edge of the concrete barrier, and then Weatherby was going to each one and checking to make sure everything was secure. Roland told us to cover our ears. I barely had time to listen as the strange resonating noise filled the empty building. Then I noticed as the noise got louder, that the wall itself seemed to shimmer the way a body of water would, rippling and vibrating frantically as our commander gave us the go-ahead. I hesitated, still unsure about any of this, but it wasn't like I had a choice. The others were already barreling towards the wall as if it wasn't there, and the rope would tug me forward anyway. I closed my eyes and ran as well, the shimmering wall looming ahead. I screamed as I thought that I would collide with it. And then I did hit it, and all around me, reality seemed to glitch. Walls shifted and jolted in and out of existence, hardly there and as firm as a brick all at once, and then I fell to the ground in front of me. It was shag carpet. the kind you might see in a hotel hallway. And as I opened my eyes, I saw that there was no need for the night vision anymore. The dim fluorescent lights revealed the long, widening corridors beyond. Immediately, my eyes darted about to find the others as I looked down at the rope. I was stretching forward down the hall, but I didn't see much farther than perhaps 20 feet until it fell in complete darkness. Then I swiveled around, expecting to see Carter entering from the real world into the strange beyond from the fake wall. Instead, I saw the same exact, endless corridors, and the rope that was tied to my body that connected to him was stretching in that direction as well for 20 feet until the darkness covered it up. Suddenly, I felt very unsure which way I had arrived, or which way I should be going. The walls and ceiling all looked the same bland colors. There were no markings or anything to tell me which direction my companions had gone. So I tried to shout, my voice sounding hollow as it echoed down the hallway. There was no answer. I walked over to the nearest wall and took out a Swiss Army knife from my pocket. I wrote an X on the wall to try to tell me where I was. Then I turned to the left and tugged at the rope, calling to Carter and the others. When silence answered back, I started to pull at the rope and use it as a guide like Matthias had intended. One step at a time in this strange dimension, I said. 700 hours. I don't know how much time's passed since I arrived, but it certainly feels like at least a few hours, because now I'm hungry. I've been following the rope, calling to my fellow soldiers every 100 feet, and wondering if I'll ever be alone forever as I wander these empty liminal spaces. I tell myself not to give up, but it's very hard when it feels like the odds are against me. I've somehow been going in circles as I found the X that I marked on the wall at least 22 times. It doesn't feel like I've turned around. The rope continues to stretch on infinitely. I decided to take a break and eat the first part of my rations, thinking perhaps if I stay out, someone will find me. I'm partially correct. It's not someone. It's something. 0830 hours. I heard something in the distance. It's a low grumbling noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I knew that it couldn't be any animal I was familiar with. It reminded me of an old video cassette recording, warping and beyond understanding, shrieking and scrambled. Somewhere in front of me. The lights above my head flickered for a moment as the noise got louder, and I stood up, keeping my hand on my rapid-fire weapon, peering down the next endless corridor where the rope stretched to. I saw something in the shadows. It was distorted and scrawny, warped all at the same time, had at least 5 appendages, twisted neck, a head that looked larger than its body, a mouth on its abdomen and claws where its eyes should have been. It moved the way that a scorpion would, its long, messy piercers stabbing in the ground as it crawled, first on the floor, then to the walls, and then the ceiling. Every time it made a noise, the entire corridor resonated with a vibrating ring of energy. It was hurrying towards me. Immediately, I opened fire on the creature, a string of bullets flying from my weapon towards its open stomach. As it got hit, the fleshy tendrils of the legs and flailing arms widened and shook madly, absorbing each blow as if it were just striking at the air, and it was growing larger, too, until the absence of its head was too bulky to even hold its own weight, and it tumbled into the room alongside me. I panicked. I cut the rope, running back the way that I had come to the right, and away from the paths that I had been following. The halls kept stretching on and on, as I weaved and hid, trying to make a distance between myself and the monster. The screams vibrated and changed from being almost on top of me to being far away as I kept moving left then right down the corridors, wondering if I was even getting farther away or not. It was difficult to be sure that there was any progress being made. Then I turned a corner and nearly ran straight into one of the others. Vincent. His eyes wide with fear as he grabbed my shoulders and clasped his hand over my mouth next to prevent any sounds from being heard. We both hunkered down next to a wall as we heard the creature scream and thrash somewhere in a different corridor. Both of us ready to run if necessary. Once the noise died down, I let out a visible sigh of relief and looked down at the rope. He had also untethered, meaning the chances of us being able to meet with the others was even less likely now. He asked if I had seen anyone else. I shook my head no. He pointed to the right. Come. There's something you need to see, he said. 10-20 hours. I'm not entirely sure if the measurement of time means much anymore, but I've been trying my best to keep track of our journey here. Carter seemed to know where he was going, following scratches on the wall to the east as he kept his weapon steady and we kept moving. Every so often he would freeze, listen, hide, and hear the strange monster as it shambled past us. And never get too close. Made me wonder if perhaps the creature itself was also lost here. Same as us. Soon I was beginning to wonder if these markings were ever going to lead anywhere. When I saw what looked like a door, and I nearly laughed in astonishment. Running towards it, I unlatched the handle and found myself staring at what resembled a fire escape of some kind. Stairs that seemed to go on infinitely forever above and below us. Carter reached into his pack and took out a small empty water bottle, tossing it to the stairwell below. We didn't hear it hit the bottom, only seeing it vanish in the bottomless pit. I was about to go exploring this passage when that thing started to hunt me, Carter explained. I wondered how far it went as I checked the rations. We had at least 4 more hours worth of food, but that didn't count for water supply. We need to find others soon, I told him. Carter didn't respond, instead using the weapon on his left shoulder to aim towards the darkness and try to judge how far down we would be going. Carter shot a random bullet into the pit, wondering if it went all the way to hell. We watched as it flew up and out of sight. And I shook my head as we climbed down. I'd say we're already there. 1,800 hours. We stop for a break and I offer what little water I have left to share with Carter as he slid down and I stretch my legs. The stairs are endless, just like the corridor we came from, and I'm beginning to get the feeling that we may never leave. It makes my throat feel dry and my legs are numb to the reality that I'll likely die here, just as it was intended. He said that Marsh would know what to do and then began to explain why the old man had volunteered. Carter laughed and tossed his empty food can into the pit. He claimed that he was searching for something, like he had been here before. I don't know. Didn't make sense, but he definitely seemed to know what he was doing. She was the commanding officer instead of Matthias. Must be some rhyme and reason to this labyrinth. I was about to reply when I heard something and looked up above. It sounded like a scream. A second later, a body fell right past me and I fumbled back against the wall. A moment later, we heard a loud thud. Getting to our feet, we ran down about 5 more floors of stairs to see that the Angelus that had been hired to keep us alive was now the first victim of this maze. I looked above us into the infinite stairwell. Do you think it was that thing? And it's following us? I asked. Carter pointed his weapon towards the corridor to the left. This one was narrow and cramped, leading to a second door which had marked on it a word that looked like it was in Latin or something. Vincent whispered that it was called Theseus as he opened the door, and we stepped into what looked like a control room of some kind. There were monitors everywhere, at least 100 of them, perhaps more, viewing all the different corridors, corners, and floors of this interior dimensional maze. And near the center I saw another impossible monstrosity. This one had to be at least 20 feet tall, judging from the angle of the camera. It was chained down on all sides so that it was difficult to be sure how large it was at its full height. It looked like a mad science experiment gone wrong, with the flesh twisted and peeled back all over its body. A mesh between a beast of the field and a man's lower torso. Its head was shaped like that of a bull with 2 bony, cracked horns curving towards the lighting fixture as its cold, dead hazel eyes peered towards the camera. It was looking towards us as if aware of its captivity, thinking of its escape. This is why this place was built, Vincent told me, his voice hardly a whisper as we checked the other cameras. There were more creatures that I couldn't describe properly on the floors, roaming free and hunting for food, or perhaps just hunting to kill. It occurred to me in these endless corridors it was likely that nothing would be available for resources, so the only thing keeping these beasts going was sheer rage, and perhaps a means of energy, like the lights, I thought as I looked away from the monitors. I thought that Commander Roland told us this place was from another reality, a step into an alien world. Why does all this look like we were the ones that made it? I asked, gesturing randomly towards the equipment. Because this is a containment facility, a voice said from the right side of the control room. It was the old man, Marsh. He was coming in, dragging the corpse of Weatherby alongside him. As I've tried to explain to the others so many times, these are the wild genetic creations that have no idea what they are, where they belong in the circle of life. This constant agony of nothingness that confines them here will only feed their anger, make them harder to control, he said, as he shut down the systems one by one. I don't understand why our organization is doing this, I said. Marsh laughed. He told me that I knew already. Weaponizing these dimensional creatures and modifying them to our slaves would change the face of war forever. When they created this liminal space, it was meant for only one monster, that horrid minotaur that I saw chained to the core, but the experiments have spread like cancers. It's gotten out of control. I'll never admit it, but these things can't be contained here forever. The maze is going to eventually implode. He said that he'd seen what it can do firsthand. He passed me a picture of a younger woman, who I guessed was his daughter, and I complimented him, saying, "Take it she was brought here? That's why you'd come?" He told me how they turned this prison into a sacrificial pit. It's the only way to keep the creatures satisfied. They wandered and moaned and consumed everything in the maze, and people like us, people cast aside like her, were the bait. Consumed by their greed, and then, as a result, the maze grows. My hands began to tremble as I passed the picture back to him, realizing what he was implying. I was told before I came here I was sent here to die. I thought that was just a wild exaggeration, but it was really a mission statement. They can't let these things loose in the real world, I whispered. And they can't kill them. Maintaining the maze and discovering what we can about them is the safest choice. But it comes with a cost. Feeding these beasts takes a lot of lives. More and more are losing theirs from what is ultimately a forgotten cause. Vincent claimed that it would never be enough. Listen to yourself. We can't go home either. We don't even know how. We need to find a way to kill these things. Marsh, you said the prison could collapse. Could we do that and eliminate the threats from the inside? Asked the old man. He rubbed his beard thoughtfully as we marched out of the control room, and he nodded, saying, "It'll take a little bit of time to get in position. There's a way. I've been there before. But I won't be doing anything until I found my daughter." I nodded, checking what little equipment we had left. "That we should move together from now on," I said. 1,600 hours. I don't think I should log time anymore, as it's become a constant threat to my sanity. I know that we've been here longer than I'm recording, yet the markers from my journal, they keep me tethered to what I once understood as reality. The endless blank hallways have stretched out on and on as Vincent and Marsh and I keep searching for the last survivor of our group, our commanding officer, along with a daughter that he lost, and I doubt's even alive. I say that because of the creatures that we've seen here in this hellhole, and Marsh has been more and more lost as time goes on. His earlier ramblings about knowing a way to stop these monsters seem like a faint memory now, as I pull Carter to the side and mutter, "How long are we going to let this old man keep us wandering? We have no idea what part of this dimensional prison that we're in." Carter's eyes were bloodshot. His lips were dry. Another reminder that we were out of time. We had no resources left, and our energy was scarce at best. Maybe we could find a way back to the command center? Find an exit? He asked, coming to terms with the fact that our search for Roland seemed endless. Before I could speak, I heard Marsh holler for us. It was a cry of distress. Despite our misgivings about the man, we dashed to where he was, in another large empty chamber, and as soon as I saw what had made him scream, I felt numb. Roland, or what was left of him, was left on display in the center of the room. His body was spliced apart, every which way you could imagine, naked and dripping blood as it was held together by what looked like long black chains. Suddenly I realized where we were. This was the center of the maze, where earlier we had seen the strange bull-like beast, the Minotaur, as Marsh had called it. But his story was now falling apart. He had claimed that this was another mad experiment that had failed, and that was what we had seen. And now we were viewing it for ourselves, and all I saw was a tortured, broken man. And yet his organs still seemed to have life in them, as a strange energy pulsed amidst the chains. Were we the experiment? Fed into the machine to face these beasts and eventually becoming them, I realized. I heard shrieks coming from the nearby corridor, and I realized that the beasts that we had been chased by earlier were likely coming here soon to harvest what was left of Roland. Marsh fell to his knees, defeated and frustrated, as he screamed and punched the blood-soaked floor. I knew he was thinking of the daughter he sacrificed everything for. Then I turned to Vincent, who was cocking his gun and aiming it at his own mouth, tears streaming down his face. "This isn't how I want it to end. I'd rather be dead than used for this freak show," he whispered in a raspy voice. I screamed for him to stop, but it was too late. The echoes of the bullet smashing through his skull alerted the creatures to my location, and I tugged at Marsh, urging him to stand. "Go without me. My children want me here," he insisted as he pushed me away. I didn't have time to argue, as the different shambling beasts were already in the core. So I ran to the left, and I didn't look back. Time unknown. How long has it been since then? And I've somehow survived. Perhaps it's been a few days, or a few months. I wait for the others to arrive as I wander this place, forced to feed off the men that are left behind, use their carcasses as shelter and security. The creatures are beginning to treat me as part of the maze, giving me my own territory, a backroom of sorts that I can wander and scribble on the walls whatever I wish. This is where I began to write warnings in my own experience of the time here, using the long fingernails and rudimentary bones that I have left from our grotesque meals, to which I can remind myself of how I once was human too. I think I walk like a man, but I can't claim to understand the world beyond the maze. Here, thanks to the endless cycles of time, I can become a god. This is likely what the experiment was meant for anyway. Although the creatures I've seen are bizarre, I've also seen how beautiful they can be. How could something so amazing and full of life be a nightmare? I returned to the command center and I saw Marsh on the cameras not long ago, wandering a different part of the maze. His skin is all but gone now, and he walks like a shadow with a limp. He continues to search for something that's long gone. Perhaps it may not even be here. Or as I have begun to lose track of time, I've understood there's no rhyme or reason to the flow of events here. We're simply here. The past is always, and the future is always. I found the place where Marsh claimed this place could be opened to the rest of the world. I walk by it often to see who is there. Sometimes I think of escape, but I doubt the world would recognize me for what I am now. The other day I saw a woman, a girl. She seems familiar, a distant memory from the life I could have had. I killed her instantly, and I used her bone marrow to restore my own energy. Her eyes were dead and accusing. I think she'd agree it was better for her to end it here on the threshold than become a part of the labyrinth. I think she may have been connected to me. Perhaps to the old man? He's part of the maze now, his body meshing with the walls, becoming absorbed. Same will happen to me. I don't know if I'll return to the world beyond, although the way is open to me. I don't think anything is there for me waiting. I don't think I belong there, as I have lost my own sanity. I'll wander these corridors stripped of any memory of what was once human and be the maze itself. Eventually, I will die, my body absorbed and cycle repeated, until one day, our world meets with the one beyond these walls. End recording. File under Daedalus Test Subject Number 13. Mission considered a success, minus the casualty of one Luca Marsh. Continue process of creating new mutations. Begin plans for next mission by end of month. Mission statement: to expand parameters of dimensional gateways to explore further details of the new dimension and determine the flow of time within. The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. The fire crackled as we sat in the front yard, the crickets tuning up and the little stream lapping at the banks of the small channel that bore it. The snow melt had been thick that year, and the small, cold snap that we had experienced the first week of June hadn't hurt it any. I had been living with Grandpa for nearly a year now, 10 months to be exact, and he had been making these bonfires a near constant Friday even since the snow melted in the spring. They suited me just fine. I had been cleaning up the spring limb falls since April, and the bonfires made a perfect excuse to get rid of them. Wait, you were just wandering in the woods? Found a house? Grandpa snorted. You telling the story or am I? I raised a hand in placation and invited him to continue. Grandpa didn't like to be interrupted. There was a little more to it than that. Aren't you paying attention? I looked away sheepishly. I'd been kind of hypnotized by the sounds of nature, and had only been half listening to Grandpa's story. He was just so peaceful out here at night, with only the fire and the bubble of darkness surrounding us. I like Grandpa's story almost as much as you all seem to, but I still get distracted every now and again. Grandpa settled himself again, giving me a look that clearly bemoaned the attention spans of the young, and began his story again. I was young when this happened. It was after my friend became a tree, before Grandma started to teach me the ways of the woods. I had started taking to the woods more often, not having anyone to play with much. Sometimes I'd come all weekend to the Appalachian Hills. My parents never worried about me. They knew that I knew the hills and hollers like the back of my hand. So when I kissed Mama goodbye one morning, my rucksack packed, she told me to be home Saturday night, so I wouldn't be late for church on Sunday. I told her I would and set out to camp the woods for the next 2 nights. This was high summer, late June, early July, and it was about as hot as it ever had got beneath the canopy of trees. I was looking forward to finding my way to a spot. I knew a little creek. I'd fish, I'd swim, generally enjoy my time in the woods. When I got to the widow's house, however, I hunkered down for a moment to make sure the coast was clear. Not because I was afraid of any widow, mind you. She was supposed to have been dead for a long time, but her house still remained, and you never knew who might be using it. It was just after the Depression. Sometimes vague tramps would use the woods for long-term camping. I heard of them robbing people and worse. Didn't want to blunder into a group of them who might be squatting into the widow's house. Now, the widow's house was a bit of an anomaly in the area. Terry Manx, just called the widow by the time I'd come along, had lived out in the woods till she was 100 years old, they said. Her husband had gone to fight the Civil War, leaving her and her young son behind. He had never returned. When her son disappeared a few years after the end of the war, the widow had been heartbroken. She lived alone in that house. Travelers said they often saw a candle burning in the window, as if to guide her son or her husband home again. She lived in that house from 1830 until she died in 1910. The townsfolk didn't discover that she had passed till someone noticed that the candle was no longer being lit and went to check on her one fateful night. The man had knocked. Upon receiving no answer, he'd gone inside to check on the poor widow. She had lived there for so long, remaining independent till the last, and it was said that he found her in a rocking chair as she sat before the remains of her last fire. The candlestick was frozen in her mummified hand. Neither decay nor corruption had touched her. She'd simply dried into a wrinkled corpse that had been buried in her chair. Or so the legend said. As if taking its cue from its mistress, the house remained eternal. It had sat in that little clearing since her death, and no amount of snow on the roof or water on the valley seemed to change it. 30 years after her death, the roof remained on, and the windows remained intact. The house sat like a monument. It would likely remain to this day, if it weren't for me. Now, I wasn't afraid of anything like that. Even so, you wouldn't catch me staying there after the sun went down, tramps or no tramps. After a few minutes of watching the house to make sure it wasn't full of homeless people, I went along and put the house out of sight and mind. I spent the next 2 days doing what I had wanted to do. Fished in the stream, explored the woods, cooked my catch over a fire. Friday night saw a creature approach my fire that I'd later call a moonchild. Smelled my fish, came to have a look. That's a story for another time. I don't want to muddy the waters too much. The story is about the widow's house, and more specifically, the widow's candle. So Saturday morning dawned warm and clear. I decided to spend the day on the banks as I fished for some dinner to bring home with me. As I lay on the bank, pole balanced against my stomach, I found myself warm, comfy, and utterly at peace. I could hear the birds as they called through the trees. I could hear the squirrels at play as they moved through the brush. I heard the gentle lap of the stream and a splash of the small fish that swam there. Before I quite knew what was happening, I had slipped off into a nap. I awoke to find the sun riding low, and my bait was gone. I judged by the sun that it was about 7 o'clock, cursed myself for sleeping away most of the day. I packed up quickly, but I knew that I'd never make it home before dark. The sun was sinking even as I packed my things into a rucksack, started making my way home with a haste. I could hear the night birds beginning to tune up. I wanted to be well and out of the woods before it got too dark. Regardless of my wants, it was fully dark by the time I made my way back to the widow's house. As I got close, I felt like I could see a light coming from it. The forest is black, dark at night, moon or no moon, and the light coming through the trees is like a beacon in the night. Thought about taking a wider trail around it after seeing that light, being sure it'd be lit by a hobo campfire, but I was 10. I don't know a 10-year-old that wasn't possessed by a wellspring of curiosity. As I got closer, I put my pack down, and I crept towards the house like an Indian raider on a prowl. The closer I got to the house, the less sure I became that it was a campfire. The blistering fire became smaller and smaller until I came to the edge of the clearing and I found the source of the light. It was a candle. A single candle left burning on the windowsill, just as the widow used to do when she was calling her menfolk home. I hunkered at the edge of the property line looking for people who might be hiding, finding no one. This would be a great way to draw in the curiosity after all. Leave a candle burning on the sill just like it says in the stories. Wait for someone to approach. You could hide beside the porch or even in the barn, and once you had him good and interested, spring out and have him. It was a great plan, except I didn't see anyone around. The porch held no hulking brutes or half-starved tramps. The barn was of the pole variety. The hiding places were minimal. They'd have to be poor fellows indeed to hide anywhere on the property, not just left someone in the house. I should have turned around and left, but I wanted a story to tell my friends when I went to school next. How exciting it'd be to sit in the warm sun on the playground, tell them all how I had seen a candle burning in the widow's house. How they would gasp and sigh when he told them about how I had gone to the window to see who had lit the candle. I could already see them putting their hands to their mouths, looking shocked when I told them what I had seen inside the place of bones. My curiosity wasn't the only thing that lured me towards that house. I'd always been a sucker for a good story, especially when it's a story I can tell others. But I suspect you've already guessed that. Standing on the porch with that candle burning behind the ancient glass window, gazing in on the one-room farmhouse that I suspect had once been considered spacious. I expected to see people in there. Maybe even people trying to hide. I kept myself low to avoid being seen. Inside, though, there was very little to hide behind. Kitchen table, a few chairs, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a few bookshelves, and, to my horror, a rocking chair. A rocking chair with someone in it. A person was sitting in front of the fireplace, and I could see a dying fire smoldering in the grate. They were dressed in a long black dress, complete with a bonnet, and a pair of knitting needles were moving slowly in their lap as they sat at work. The chair was going back and forth slowly. The whole scene seemed almost surreal. I backed away, trying to get back to my pack and get the hell out of there with my story. That was when the door creaked open with a noise like a swollen hinge and a mouthful of rust. The voice that followed, it sounded twice as creaky and just as spooky. "Thomas, is that you? It's so dark, son. Can you come help your poor mother?" I was frozen there, looking back at the open door as the raspy croak beckoned me inside. You likely won't believe me. None of my school friends did when I told them, but I was torn as I stood there with my fear crawling like bugs up my spine. On the one hand, the whole situation was just so weird, and all I wanted was to show my heels all the way home. On the other, this woman sounded old, possibly infirm, and my mother had always taught me to help people in need. It was the Christian thing to do, after all. And as the creaky old voice asked if I was there, I took my first shaky steps onto the porch and walked into the widow's house. The inside was Spartan, but it was warm and dry for a house that had been empty for 30 years. I could now see why the vagrants liked it so much, and I imagined I could smell pastries and fresh bread as I crossed the threshold. Fire was warm too, and when the door didn't slam shut behind me to trap me inside, I felt that perhaps this was just some old woman who was just a little lost. "Thomas? Is that really you? I waited so long for you, boy. Why have you kept your mother waiting?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not Thomas. I think you must be mistaken." She cut me off before I could say more, though, swishing her hand at the candle on the windowsill. "Bring that candle over here so I can have a look at you, Tommy. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and it's so dark in here." See, I thought that was odd. She was sitting right in front of the fire, but I was too well-mannered to argue with her. I was becoming less and less afraid with every step I took. And when I picked the candle up, I saw the flame waft a little before it went out. She tutted then, though how could she see that the flame had gone out was beyond me. But her words were so good-natured as she called to me to light it again. "Silly boy, you've gone and put out the flame. Come light it again so your old mother can have a look at you." I walked past her, her sewing needles still clicking as her old chair creaked away merrily. Bending low, I stuck the tip of the candle into the dying flames and saw it wink back to life. Then I turned, candle held out before me, as I started to ask if that was better. When I caught sight of her, I came to realize why she thought it was so dark. The woman had no eyes. Her face looked like a burlap sack, like a scarecrow whose face had been drawn a little too well, and her toothless mouth grinned wetly at me. I saw the hollow pits where her eyes should be. It was the widow, sure as I'm still here, and when I dropped the candle onto her, she went up like a pyre. I stood in horror as she burned, her mouth open, splitting as she laughed and laughed. Such a warm welcome, and as she croaked out her cobwebby mirth, I ran for the door. I could feel the heat behind me as the dry boards of the widow's house caught fire. But I never stopped running. I didn't bother with my pack either. I just ran for home, the image of that eyeless old mummy carved perfectly into my mind forever. When I got home, my mother was waiting for me. All her bluster at me being late and lost as I threw my arms around her, I never told her what had happened. She never asked. At that moment, I was just happy to have the protective walls of her arms around me. Went back for my pack a few days after school. It was exactly where I had left it, but I couldn't help noticing the burnt husk of the widow's house. See, the house had burned to the ground, nothing left but ashes and charred boards. I never went near that spot again. People of the town thought it had been the vagrants, and I never tried to dissuade them from that idea. The children I told the story to never seemed to believe me, and I was always careful not to tell it to any adults. They think it an omission of guilt, and I didn't want anyone to think that it was a fire I had set on purpose. The spot remained barren to this day. Nothing will grow there. Nature seems unwilling to come and retake its space. I thought about going back there to pay my respects sometimes, but it's not a place I'd ever want to return to. I think, deep down, I'm still afraid of seeing her there. Toothless mouth, laughing, and sunken pits looking for her lost son. It's an image that I'll carry forever. The crackling fire caught a pine knot then, and I was pulled from the story as I jumped. Is there anything out there in those woods that isn't horrifying? I asked, finishing my beer as I threw the bottle into the woods. This was a habit I'd picked up from Grandpa. Seemed as natural as breathing now. Of course, he said. You've seen some of it, but the world's full of dangers that most likely any animal can be conquered if you know how. Your studies are coming along well. By the time you learn all that I have to teach, I'm sure I won't feel so hesitant about dying. I patted his hand. Hopefully, not for a long time yet. He smiled, but I thought it looked a little sad. We can only hope. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. If you scroll down to the description at the very bottom, you'll find a whole bunch of people there. Also, we've included this nice little scrolling thing because the number of people who support me on Patreon has gotten so big that I'm afraid it might actually max out the description. So we've included this here as the little scrolling text on the end screens. So everybody on that scrolling text, everybody I'm about to mention right now and mispronounce all of your names, and everybody who can donate even $1, thank you so much. A very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Reaper61167, Bobby Karman, Tristain, Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Vicky McQuicky, SamaHigh, CrusaderChocobo, SpookyShel, Atomaurus, Grand Moth the Milky, Big Smoke 369, Captain Scurvy, SaltyIrishPoet, Estebean, Brayden Morris, Nate Kuhl, HorrorFan1212, Hour Minute Second Time, Kyle Reznak, David Martin, scare-ington the unkempt, Robert Malcolm, Angelus, Spanky, Snoochie Boochie, Seclude, Lupita Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Tyler Fletcher, Merxenum, Red Shadow Cat, Xavier the Cheyenne, Demix, Sean Cadieu-baker, 6 Gay Rats in a Trenchcoat, Turtleman, Rob Like Sharp Things, Cryolinian, Xavier Graphius, Lord Life's Best, Goring Tramagasi, Maria Walker, Emily Mitchell, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Aka Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Coffee Zombie, Hidden Tiger, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Psychomel, Nana, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Titanic Aries, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Sashi Suzaku, Cronut 509, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Benjamin Welvert, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiwi the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. As always, thank you guys so much, because you guys help me do everything that I do here. You guys help pay authors for stories and commission stories and do everything that I can do to make this channel and make this podcast the best it could possibly be. So thank you all for supporting me here. And as always, everyone, sweet dreams.